Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Real Love Guitars again, and it's raining again, and it's a Tuesday evening, and this is a strange combination of question and answer meets doing some of the setup on Ralph's Telecaster here. Now, I thought about how to do these things, and to be honest, I know a lot of people do questions and answers by sort of pointing cameras at their faces and talking to the camera. And to be honest, that's not really my kind of thing. I don't know. Just I don't think it's. You don't want to sit here looking at me being distracted by questions, because I think when people do it on live, kind of. When they do the questions in the live feed type of thing, it's terrible because they never complete a sentence. I'm bad at that anyway, but I can't stand watching all of these Q&A live things when the host is constantly distracted by the next hello or super chat or whatever the thing is that's coming in to pay more important than answering questions or talking about subject at hand. Hey, look, cash. I don't blame them, but it does make for a good listening or discussion or whatever. So I thought what I would do is, rather than, I thought I've got work to do. This is Ralph's Telecaster. I'm going to at this point I'm going to level the frets and then polish them out. And this is a neck that I've finished in gloss satin. No, gloss satin. No, that's not. Gloss nitro. And so it's kind of nothing, there's nothing more spectacular that's going to happen to it this evening other than I'm going to I'm looking at something a minute. I'm going to level these frets. See, I'm being distracted by looking at things. Level the frets, crown them and sand and polish them. And I might fit the nut to here. This is a Tusk 12-inch radius nut. But that we'll see. I've got another one coming for the Strat, which is on hold. Anyway, that's beside the point. So I thought what I'd do is, rather than talk about global politics, which some people like and some people don't, actually it was Claire had the idea of doing a question and answer originally, and I thought, what a good idea. So I put a little thing out, and people on Facebook supplied me with, actually, what I've got here is about 13 different questions. So I'll go through those while I'm doing stuff, and I might make use of the whiteboard in my usual fashion, and I might also insert some pictures along the way in the editing process, of which I never do any editing. So Ralph, if this seems like a funny use of your setup, the setup's still going on, but I just thought, let's see how it works. If it doesn't work this way around, then I'll change over to doing a Q&A just on its own. But the idea of sitting there and kind of looking straight in the eye and, Anyway, so let's begin with the questions. There were loads of them. So, first one comes from Bart van der Avort. Now, if I pronounce your name wrong, that's part of the pleasure of doing this. And some of them I know aren't your real names, so you can chuckle while I take it seriously like it is your real name. So Bart is the first one, and he says, I'm often told that any new guitar, be it budget or A brand, needs a proper setup. Can anyone do this? And what is the best way to go about this? So there's two parts really to that. He says putting a tick next to it so I know which one I've covered. That any new guitar, be it budget or A brand, need a proper setup. And the answer is, if I can get the truss rod down from up here, the answer is almost always yes. It's not exclusively yes, because there are occasional guitars that are very well done and have had the work done, perhaps in the custom workshop or whatever they were produced in. There are some guitar firms that have done such a great job that they are they barely need any work, but they are a rarity. They're few and far between. So the answer to the question is, budget or A brand needs a proper setup. Does it? The answer is yes. People can. So I'm doing two things now. I can't do the other thing. I can do one of the two. I can talk, but I can't. I can talk and do stuff, but I don't have to be concentrating too hard. Yeah. So this will be a bit rambling, so I can at least concentrate somewhat on the guitar setup. So in answer to the question, when I started out doing this, I thought that. I suppose when I grew up, I was like a lot of people, and I believed, and I think it was more hope than belief, but in a great sort of thing of hope, I hoped that one day when I had enough money, I'd be able to buy an expensive brand name guitar, and it would confer on me a beautiful setup and a beautiful low action, and everything would just be perfect. And of course, when you're younger and you don't have the option, you haven't got much money, and you're constantly buying cheaper guitars, you can sort of convince yourself that theory about the way the world works is correct, because, well, first of all, you never seem to, because you can't afford a more expensive guitar, you also then never get to learn for yourself that it isn't actually true. So while you can't disprove that idea that you've sort of held to be true for so long, you continue to hold that belief. So that's what I believed, and eventually I think some people learn that it isn't true by buying the more expensive guitar and then find out that it plays like a dog, and many people will know that experience from buying things like Gibsons, and certainly a lot of Gibsons in a certain period of years of manufacture turned out to be pretty lousily finished in lots of ways, and also had playability issues. They just weren't playable from the outset. So the truth is, just about all guitars need setting up, and the reason why, I think when you start to get a bit hard-nosed about it, comes down to the economic constraints. So there's a mechanical issue, and that is sticking frets into a neck is by and large a pretty imprecise method. It's mechanical, and you're pushing solid metal or rigid metal frets into pliable wood that's a bit organic and does its own thing, and you're doing it with what's relatively a certain amount of guesswork in how hard you're doing the pushing in, and so as a result, it's not very scientific. And once the frets go in, they can either go in at different amounts of force, because it's, as a person hammering frets in, you can't really be certain to use the same force every time, and so on and so forth. So the point here is that it is an imprecise business, and consequently all guitars come with uneven frets to some degree or other. Now, the way to prevent that is really to work on the frets after they've been pushed in. There is no real system for super precision. They can get more precision in the types of guitars that are made with composite materials, and sometimes don't even have frets. So they have just sort of bits that stand up and are made to tiny tolerances. Can be sometimes stainless steel guitars necks, or aluminium necks sometimes have frets that are part of the neck. But generally speaking, it's a crude mechanical process, and so that even if you're the best of people, perhaps a way to say it is there aren't many luthiers I've ever heard of that can tap in or press in a series of frets and they'd be perfect to play from that second onwards. It's very rare. I've done quite a bit of fretting, and I would still say it's about maybe 1 in 30 I might accidentally get good enough to play straight off. So what I'm doing here, by the way, is I'm just tightening the truss rod a little bit. If I can get access to it into here. So before I do my fret leveling, I want it to be as have the relief where I want it, which is flatter than it was. Okay, that's good. So I'm going to do the leveling on that basis. Yeah, so the mechanics of putting in frets is fairly imprecise, and so that anything with wood and metal ends up being more or less tiny amounts of unevenness, which don't sound like much, but when you realize that the amount of unevenness required to make things buzz or choke is very, very small, because the lower the action, the less tolerant the playability is of even the tiniest high frets or low frets. Also, when you lay all the frets into your neck, one of the things I found over the years is that when it's loaded, fitted to the guitar and put under compression of the strings, the neck sort of goes into, no matter what it was doing before, then when it's loaded it goes into a slightly wavy form, and it's very slight, but and that's what's in play right here with compression in the longitudinal direction. This neck is, not only is it slightly overall curved, which we need it to be a little bit, but in being curved it isn't precisely curved. It's like a little topography of hills and valleys. And so that compression and the loading of the strings on that particular piece of wood causes some unevenness. Now you can imagine that Fender can do the best they can to get the best quality of woods, quarter sawn this, laminate that. And the manufacturers do as much as they can to reduce this sort of random movement in the wood, but it's still wood at the end of the day. So it will have, even if you have that you fret to the best ability of your craftsman persons, and you the neck is as beautifully done as possible, when you can compress it with string loading, even then it changes its topography very slightly. And that's what I'm attacking here with my leveling method, which is one of the ways, or the way I like to deal with these frets. Now, what I'm conscious of right now is that these frets are covered over in the gloss finish that I put sprayed on, so there's going to be a bit of kind of grinding that off first before really paying too much more attention to the actual levelness. It isn't bad altogether, this neck, anyway, so I'm as much leveling to just clean up the whole of the fret surface as I am to cure any unevenness, but we will cure any as it comes along. So this is your typical guitar neck with its underloading, when loaded, strange shapes and hills and valleys. So the answer to the question is, this quality or characteristic of fretted necks is kind of universal, whether it's made in a top quality factory or whether it's made in a cheap Chinese. Can you get worse? Yes, you can get worse. Of course, you can get things that are so badly put together that the fret's sticking out, and that's just carelessness and lack of quality control in the factory. So you can get it worse, but even the best ones need some sort of work. Now the other thing, or fret leveling I should say, and of course if you ask yourself why don't the factories do that, and actually whether they're big factories making name brands or whether they're smaller or big factories making cheaper brands, so for different price points, you have to kind of recognize that they're all working to a very similar and very constricting, limiting economic model, and this is the model that says you're basically playing a price war game between you and every other player at your price point, and that means that everybody's looking to cut costs down, because of course the customer wants the smallest possible price for whichever price point you're at. And with the customer wanting the smallest price point, every manufacturer cuts back on the one thing that costs most, which is human labor time. little bit more up there to do. So when you cut back on human labour, the first thing you do really is you invest in machinery for automation. So when you have automation, you end up with a factory that's sort of churning out things more or less, and you put in people every now and then to check key aspects of it at key points. And it doesn't have the same kind of attention to playability or detail, arguably, than a human craftsperson does when making a guitar that they care about. So even if even when the machinery that saves you money as a manufacturer is very accurate, the lack of the depersonalization, you could call it, doesn't really bode well for checking. But more importantly, where it really shows up is where, as I said, the point being that all guitars come with slightly uneven frets. So let's say we have a guitar coming off the production line which has those same slightly uneven frets, and the question is, what do we do about it? And if you're somebody who really cares about playability, you put some time and money, because time is the money, you put time and therefore money into doing the fret work required to throw them on the floor, required to make it playable. So given all those frets are slightly standing in different positions, and given that the only way to make them all play the same is to do a little bit of leveling, what you need, the only way around it, is some way of leveling the frets, which will make them beautifully even and therefore allow you to have, or the customer, to have the low action without any buzzes and chokes, which everybody wants. But the problem with this is that suddenly you're into time, human beings' time. And so to put right, or to fine-tune the crude mechanical process that I talked about, that fretting is, you've got to pay people. And that condition is there whether it's a £1,000 American Fender or whether it's a £200 Chinese budget guitar. There may be some differences in, like I said, it may even be some gross, more cruder fretting practices, but usually a cheap Chinese factory can do fretting as well as anyone else can do it. You know, it's not rocket science, but it is also not precise. So both the high quality brand name brand guitar, and the cheap one have the same problem. And for both of them, the only solution is to invest some human beings' time. Now, some people say, what about the Plek machine? And that's true. But they made Plek machines so expensive that it has to be charged out. Has to be charged out as a custom, that's not the word, you know what I mean, a premium service. And what is on there? Is that, I think I could well be just failing to clean off the material here. I'm going to, while we talk, I'm going to upgrade this paper, just so we've got absolutely clear stuff. Right. Yeah, anyway, so the same problem faces both of them. And what you find is that people instinctively believe that the quality factory, Fender, makes so much more per guitar that it has tons of room in its finance model, if you like, that it can afford to, it should afford to, and it should be absolutely obliged to afford to spend that money on having somebody in the factory doing a precision fret leveling and taking care of that and sorting it all out. But the reality is, I think I haven't seen the figures, but I would bet you that the Fender factory doesn't make anywhere near as big a margin as you think, mainly because as it grows, it's become a huge employer, it's become a huge owner of real estate for its brand, and it has different costs compared to the Chinese cheap manufacturer. So I think what you have to recognize is that Fender, despite it charging you a premium price such that you feel really hard done by when it doesn't do the little details you think it should. I think you'd probably find that Fender is working to as tight a margins as the budget players are, and so that by the way, within margins, I also include what they have to pay to their shareholders, whether you think that's fair or not, and I'm not really debating that, but the point is, it's a factor built into their models. Now, where did I put the last bit of this stuff that I used but didn't use up? I put it somewhere to come back to it, because otherwise I'm going to end up using a complete new piece. I rolled it up and I put it somewhere where I'd obviously find it, which is not going to happen. So I've got so much of it, I'll make a new roll of it and I will hang the next roll up somewhere there where I'll find it. Anyway, so the thing is, your Fender's cost base goes up, and in its cost base is whatever amount it is forced or has committed to pay to its shareholders, which, whether you and I agree with it or not, is however much it has to pay, and it's part of its model. So it's freedom to suddenly add 3/4 of an hour of somebody's precision, skilled handcraft time into this product is limited. They don't have that space to do it, really. And that sounds a bit, doesn't cut much mustard when you go, well, I've paid £1,000 for this, I expect you to put in 2.5 hours more or an hour more or whatever it takes of somebody's time served, skilled labour. And I understand that. But the truth is, they probably can't do it because of the way they've lined up their business model already. So I'm going to stick this with an old bit. This might not be a good idea. It might be. Just so I don't think it's going to hold. It'd be quite nice if it just sort of stayed there till I needed it next time. Let's put it inside of there. Whatever. Anyhow, so it's a long answer to a very short question. So the point is, whatever the brand, price point, fretting is crude. It has to be put right by the only method you can put it right by, which is leveling the frets. And leveling the frets, unless you own a plec and are prepared to include the rental and unit purchase cost of that machine into the business model, the price model of your product, then you will find that you can't afford to buy that machine and run it, unless you charge the customer for it at some point or other. And the customer who's looking for their thing at a certain price is not going to be happy with that. And so what happens is the manufacturers sort of do their best, various versions of their best. Sometimes it's getting a bit better these days. So their best used to be not much, and then they left it to luthiers to tell you, oh no, a Strat should, or a Tele should always have a high action because blah blah, quote Clapton, reference Gary Moore, whatever. And the whole sort of, I think, a whole kind of history narrative of bullshit, falsehoods kind of grew up to permit the manufacturers to put out guitars that were less than playable, with all kinds of mystique about why you wouldn't expect a guitar to be playable. And actually, it is down to just this last bit of precision to make it playable at the sort of action that we like. And you might be somebody who totally detests a low action, in which case none of this applies to you, and you probably find that most of your guitars are set up kind of the way you like them. I'm just going to whiz back a minute on this one to make sure we just get rid of the gloss on the top of these frets with this new stuff. So anyway, so that's why all guitars have uneven frets, even the expensive ones, and the reason they don't put them right is almost certainly down to an economic factor, that it costs time and money to do. Now that's just the fret part. The other part of the setup, which is crucial, and again, historically takes a lot of time, and you sort of see the pattern emerging, and that is the nut. The nut is critical to make the guitar play and stay in tune, but also in making the guitar playable at all, at any action, right, but particularly low actions. So the pattern here is that, as you can tell, a guitar nut is also a crude thing. You stick it on in a slot that you've cut at a certain depth on in your factory, hoping that the tooling and whatever your machinery gives you a pretty accurate amount, but it's never 100% precise, and your production of your plastic or whatever nut you use is also never completely perfectly precise. And you put those two things together and hope it all works, and you try to get as close as you can, and then you get it within what you decide is a tolerable range, and then you get it out the door. And the question about what is a tolerable range, some people think that would come from a luthier sitting in the factory think tank, you know, the inventing room, as you have, as what's his name, Willy Wonka would have. But it's far more likely that somebody in the marketing and sales department says, at what point have any been returned to us with buyers saying, we can't play this, it's impossible? And they'll go on that as their guideline, and they say, well, above this amount it's unplayable, therefore, or, you know, we've got to keep them within this tolerance. So they will go for a workable tolerance, and it will be driven ultimately by, look, are people still buying these? Well, yes, they are. Then there isn't a problem to fix. Get them out the door, and so on. And that's kind of it's not that surprising. That's how it is. You know, you can understand it as a kind of cold business logic, really. And that's where we come in. I mean, we've always bought guitars almost regardless or irrespective of how much they went out of tune or how hard they were to play. So, again, the point about this is that the nut is critical to how your guitar plays and whether or not it stays in tune. And it's also a crude process to install it. There's very little science. There's some measurement and some machine factory slot cutting and plastic molding and so on, and you get it into what you set out as a workable range of operation, and you sort of go with it, providing you don't get too many complaints, and that will be tolerable. So what kinds of things do you need to improve that? Well, I've always said that the nut and the slack in your strings accounts 50% each of your tuning stability. It's got nothing to do with the tuners. It has everything to do with the nut and the slack. To get the nut right, it has to be the right material. The slots have to be cut right, and so they don't drag. The material has to be right, so it also helps it not to drag on the strings. And it has to be set in the guitar so that the first fret action is precisely the right or an ideal height to make the guitar both playable at that end and also at the correct height, so that when fretting notes near the nut itself, they don't go sharp because they're too high. This looks pretty radical, but it's the paint being cut off the frets more than anything else, so there'll be a bit more of this to do. Okay, so you know that getting that nut right so your guitar will play takes time and quality materials. So either it takes time because you're cutting the slots down, if that's the way you do it, or it takes time because you're working the bottom of the nut to a point where it leaves the slots at the perfect height to give the perfect first fret action. Whichever way, it takes time. And that time, guess what, costs money. And you know, when you stand back from all of this and people say, well, if all guitars need setups, even the expensive ones, why do they get away with it? I mean, they must know that they don't play very well, like your Gibson with your big plastic nut they used to have, or bone, you know, sticking out miles, and a huge action down at the first fret. Why do they do it? Why does Gibson think it can get away with that? And the answer is because they can, because we keep buying their guitars. Because there are enough of us tied into that myth that once we spend 1,700 quid and we get that Gibson, it will fix all those problems. Not that we actually know what they are, because at that point, until we've reached our own sort of rock bottom and have to look at what really makes the guitars play well, we still A, believe the myth, because B, we're in the dark really about what works and what doesn't when it comes to guitar playing actions and playability. So of course the solution to that is to know more, and that's what I've always argued, that the more you know about the basics of this, the less you're going to get just strung along and sold myths, you know, about better and better tuners. They won't do anything for you. Tuners, all tuners do is they make the guitar, or the tuning machines, smoother and feel a bit sexier. Well, this is nice, and you know, if you've got the money, spend it on that. Why not? I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. But if you think it's going to fix the problem with your plastic nut or your bone nut that's gripping the strings and is cut completely wrong, and so on and so forth, then you're mistaken, and you'll be spending 80 quid on your new tuners for not get the result you hope. Funnily enough, I've seen people who insist that it has solved their problem, and I think there's a part of that is we can't admit to ourselves that we were hooked into something and it hasn't solved our problem. So I think we kind of collude in pretending it has. It's just a theory of mine, but anyway. So what I just want to check, breaking off bits of ice, but the notes are playing, which is good. Now I'm going to prepare to recrown these frets, and the whole thing is I've got to break off this existing this finish that I put on them for it to play well, and we will do it through the process of recrowning and sanding the frets out. My only nervousness comes when I get ready to take off the or get ready to put on and then remove the masking tape, which I used to protect the fingerboard, because I don't want this freshish gloss to come off. Now if it does, well, you know, such is the way. I haven't charged Ralph, I didn't charge you for this process. It took quite a few goes to get the build up of the stuff right, but we agreed, and it was a freebie as part of Ralph bringing me 3 guitars. So hopefully it won't need any more time, because as you remember, time is money. Anyway, that's something to watch out for. String ends. If you move away from your bench quickly and the strings have grabbed you round the body parts, as in hooked into your clothes, then you can have a very unpleasant accident. Right, so frets are uneven by default. Nuts are terribly cut from the wrong material, and together with the slack not being stretched out of the strings, and by stretched out I don't mean 5 minutes of just grabbing them and pulling them. I mean, like, you know, thoroughly stretched out so that they don't detune any further. And if those things aren't done, then the guitar won't play very well. And if you do those things, that's what I call a setup. There's nothing less than that to me is worth calling a setup, and that's why I don't offer a light setup. There's no point somebody bringing me their guitar, paying me 45 quid, and I just change the strings, maybe oil the fingerboard for them. It's pointless, because it won't have addressed the frets, it won't have leveled the frets, it won't have recrowned them, it won't have changed the nut for tusk, it won't have cut the slots to the right height, and it won't have stretched out the strings and made sure the action was right. So what's the point? It's just charging money for wasting people's time. And so we've talked about the fact that the business models that we can sort of understand on the cheap mass-produced things, but we don't like to admit that someone like Fender is subject to the same business model. We like to think they've got more cash floating around because they charged us so much. Well, unfortunately, it isn't true. They may have an obligation to return a certain amount of profitability to their shareholders because they're such a big company that we find offensive, because we think it should better be spent on making sure the damn guitar is fret leveled and plays beautifully before it comes out. But unfortunately, that's not how the mass production business, mass market works. They have to return a certain amount of profitability, returns, and they do it basically by cutting costs of manufacture, costs of labour, costs in time, and by buying bigger, cheaper amounts of stuff. So it's all, I have to say, it's all a race to the bottom, and we'll come back to that later. If I get through one question, I will do. By the way, I didn't plan how many I'd get through. So Bart, in answer to that first part, your next part was, your question, does every guitar need a setup? Almost all of them do, except those have been hand finished, I would say. I don't think there's a single machine system that is capable of producing something capable of being played at a very low action with the precision that we aim for. Your second part is, can anyone do this, and what's the best way to go? And yes, the answer is anyone can do this. And I don't want to, well, luthiers don't like to say that because they don't really want everyone doing it, because if you all do it, then I don't have any business. And quite frankly, if I don't do this particular business, I can't see what else I'm going to do in my ripe old age, because I'm good. I'm not really a corporate being anymore, and I'm not going to be traipsing to somebody's office 9 to 5. Anyhow, my bleak future aside, yes, anyone can do this. What you have to have is, I think it really helps to not be the kind of person who believes mythologies about things, right? You have to be, in the religious world, it used to be called an iconoclast, didn't it? Somebody who didn't like icons and tore them down so they weren't worshipped. Maybe it doesn't really have a good use, that word, outside of religion. But I'm somebody who I don't buy stuff just because somebody says it and everybody believes somebody who said it once, kind of thing. I think you do well to do this kind of work. You do well to have a questioning mind, and so and a tendency to believe what you see evidence for. And that doesn't always have to be your own evidence, because you can't do every experiment, and there are some things you have to research and learn from other people's experiments and experience. But you have to have an attachment to evidence above conventional wisdoms and myths, and well, they all say that, therefore. So if you're evidence kind of oriented and you're logical and you question dogmas, that really helps in this business. So to learn setup, some people say, go and work with a luthier. The trouble with going to work for so-called, well-known luthiers, or the people who call themselves experienced expert luthiers, some of them can, judging by what I've read and seen online, for example, some of them can be hooked up into a lot of dogma, first of all, and also some of them can be kind of tied up in a slight fearfulness that if they, if everyone knew what they knew, then they would be out of work, and the more you know, the less business will be there for them, and so on. And I think if you sort of live by that logic, I think it's a pretty difficult way to be. But anyway, so can anyone do it? Yes. I'll give you an example of something that's what I mean by the iconoclasm, as in not accepting dogma, just because somebody once told you it in a forum, or somebody who claimed to be an expert time-served luthier. This idea about the truss rod, you'll probably have deep down inside you, well, many people have a fear of adjusting their truss rods, because somebody once said, who seemed to know, that be careful, I wouldn't advise you to, wouldn't do that if I were you, because you could seriously damage your neck, right? Best let a qualified luthier, like me, they would say, do it for you. And that's absolute nonsense, right? The sooner you get shot of that sort of gobbledygook, woo, in your head, the better. The truss rod is a completely understandable, common sense, logical device, mechanical device, that doesn't buck the laws of physics, and it doesn't break your guitar. It's there precisely. Fender would never have gone for any of this stuff. It's there precisely for you personally, to adjust the curvature of your neck, right? And it's provided for you to do it in full knowledge that it isn't going to break that lovely strong wooden neck in you doing it. I've done a video somewhere of me trying to break a truss rod, and I couldn't. Now, of course, to make me wrong, everything can be proved wrong. Somebody can go and break a truss rod, and sometimes that can happen if your truss rod is seized up, or if you swing on it so hard you've got your whole body weight on it and you're desperate to try and break it. I'm sure you can. But in normal operation, without literally throwing your entire body weight onto it, you cannot, in normal operation, break a truss rod. And that's just one of the myths that is kind of, can't help but think it's there to stop people doing this themselves. So answer part 2 to Bart's question is, yes, you can do it. Just be open-minded. Don't buy anything, don't swallow anything from just because somebody said so. Question everything and be convinced by that for which there is evidence. That's what I would say about life generally, but hey, that's me. So anyone can do it. Do you need expensive tools? Is that a bar to doing it? No. My ebook, which is available at all good, now it's available in lots of places, but it's much betterly available from me, so I get the cover price. But my ebook, 5 Steps to Guitar Setup Heaven, was all about doing this work with tools that cost practically nothing. Now this tool cost 120 quid or something 8 years ago, right? So it's paid for itself. And I bought it knowing it was extremely expensive, but I'd started out using a standard 3-sided file, which I still keep around for occasional use when the situation demands it. But the point I'm making is I use this because doing as many setups as I do, it makes sense that I have a time saver, okay? But you don't have to have it if you're only doing your own 4 or 5 guitars. Look, there's the 3-sided file that I've had since as long as I've had that, or a bit longer. And that's perfectly good. It takes a little bit longer, but not even that much when you compare it to a whole day of what you might be doing with your spare time. So, no, it doesn't take massively expensive things. Do you need, take another thing that everyone insists that you need, like the notched ruler that people have criticised me in the past, saying, I never see you using one of these notched rulers. And if you don't see me using one, it's because I don't have to, right? So the way I do the levelling, I don't need to set the neck straight, therefore I don't need to have one of those notched rulers, and therefore I bought one, and now it sits there doing nothing because I don't need it. And I bought one because I thought I should have one, right? Like a lot of people do when they start this sort of thing. So my ebook is written from the point of view of how do you do a setup without expensive tools. And the truss rod you saw me just now, the banana I call it, for reasons I'll hopefully get to later on in this Q&A. The banana file is something that, well, you can make it from an old regular standard truss rod. I started that way, but in fact I bought one specially, and it cost me about 15 quid. But because I wanted a wider and stiffer one, and anyway, but you can use one that out of a neck you've saved from the the wood burner kind of thing. It doesn't have to be spending a lot of money. So yes, anyone can do it, and I will get people who will I get people who will say things like, I've seen you do things, you know, like you just then you clonk to this finish with your tool, right? I would never let you have my guitars ever. And I will say, well, you know what? Everybody clonks somebody's guitar now and then. The only difference is most of the luthiers who criticise me would have edited it out and changed the scene at that point, so you didn't see them doing it, because they would be ashamed to clonk the finish like that. But so, and a lot of luthiers would say you shouldn't use that tool to do this, and where the kinder ones amongst them have said, look, there's this thing available, haven't you ever seen one of those? And quite often I haven't, because there's no reason why I should. So when people are sharing information like that, I value it, and I quite often go and adopt the thing they showed me if it makes sense and it's worth changing to. So I have no problem in that, and I recommend that where you evaluate that it's worth doing that, you take that advice too. But there's lots of things where people say I must do something a certain way, and actually there's no good argument for it. And I've been through this kind of subject quite a few times, where it's very typical of YouTube comments where people insist that you should do a thing a certain way, and you ask them for their argument. You know, what's the hypothesis behind your claim that I'm wrong? You know, in the nicest possible way, I want to understand it. And they don't have a hypothesis, they just have a position, which is that you're wrong, because for whatever reason. And it's usually that somebody that they respect told them another thing once upon a time, and so you're wrong and they're right. And nobody learns anything because they don't recognise that they're just spouting dogma, and you don't work out what it is they're misinformed about, or what it is that they know that could help you. And usually it isn't anything. But anyway, so that's the frets levelled and the finish taken off these frets. So what I'm next line up to do is the that thing, masking it off, and it scares me. Now this is a throwaway nut. This is the original plastic nuts that's going in the bin. Yeah, so there you go. Look, I've managed one whole Q&A so far, but that's okay because I didn't have a set target of how much. So Bart, I hope that answered your question and was useful for anyone else who was listening, who stayed awake long enough. So I've got now one from Martin, and this is a technically one really. What are the main pitfalls of attaching a new fingerboard to a neck that has been stripped of its previous one? How to ensure the scale length doesn't get wonky? Pre-slotted fingerboards bought, for example, from a reliable, assuming a pre-slotted fingerboard from a reliable manufacturer. So a pre-slotted fingerboard from a reliable manufacturer, actually this isn't one because this is one I made myself, but let's imagine I was a reliable manufacturer and I bought this. Here's one I didn't buy earlier. I didn't put that under there ready for this question, you know that? That's the truth. So, you know, let's imagine also that this had lost its fingerboard and frets because something happened and we'd managed, and this is the first if, well, first big assumption, assume you'd managed to pull off the original fingerboard, which when you want to get them off, they are nigh on impossible to get off without damaging the wood underneath. When you don't want them to get off, you can just drop the guitar 3 inches to the ground and the fingerboard will spring off if it feels like it. But let's imagine it's springed off or you've hacked it off and now it's time to put your new what's it on. Martin's question is quite right. If I were to place that, of course, is a difference? Yes, it's the same scale, isn't it? Or is it? No, I'm looking at it from an angle. So it's the same, essentially the same scale. 648. Yeah. So the important bit is if you are going to replace this, and imagine we might not. You probably don't have the neck attached to the body, but the neck will go into the body at a certain amount. So you're quite right. You can't just slap that on there wherever you think it looks best. You have to line it up where the original slot and first fret sit and end up with this new thingy sitting on exactly where it's at before, because that means the distance between the nut and the bridge saddles will be the same as before. Now, I've got to say, if you look at, if I hold this in place, which I can't very well, if you were to think about this as a live example, it's not exactly a good one, but take a bridge like this. This bridge has a lot of leeway. Can you see that we've got probably from the front of that spring there, front of that screw there, that saddle could go from right close to the front of there down to about halfway easily. So you've got about maybe 25 mils of travel available probably for each one of these saddles. That 25 mils of adjustment room there could soak up any reasonable amount of slight miscalculation on here. So let's say, for example, we got it wrong and I forgot where the original thing was and I positioned it like that. How much out of sync is that from the original? Okay, it's about what, 4 or 5 millimeters at most. Well, there you go. That bridge will soak up that difference comfortably, right? Because we just move the things back if that's too much that way, and we might not even know whether it's too far forward or too far back. We probably would, but let's say we didn't even know. Well, the intonation process would tell us. It would go, wow, this is way short, and you go backwards with your saddles, and then it would all work out. So with this type of bridge, you've got so much leeway for further adjustment that you could afford to be quite careless. Now, nobody wants to do that, because the obvious thing is your bridge may not have that anywhere near that amount of intonation. In fact, this kind of bridge, this Telecaster screwed down on the top Telecaster bridge, this has got more adjustment room than just about any kind of bridge there is. So this is a good example of the most forgiving one that you could get this wrong by quite some distance. You could be a centimetre out and still get it to play without it looking ridiculous, right? You don't want that. So how would you do it? Well, you would ideally start by working out where as close as you can to where the original nut slot was. If you can't do that, you have to kind of make a good guess, right? You would say, okay, this is a Strat type of guitar. There's usually about 2 mils behind the nut slot, or Tele style, 2 mils or so behind the nut slot. It very rarely, if ever, comes up to a point there. You've always got a millimetre or two for the little strength of this section here. Sometimes it's more than that. It's more like 3, like on this one here. But there's always 2 or 3 mils behind there. And if it's a Tele style, you'd guess on that and you place your nut there. You would get worried if you had very little adjustment room in your saddles, but you've got tons there. It gets a little more precise when you're dealing with, I haven't got one just kicking around, but let's say you're dealing with a Les Paul with a fixed neck, the fingerboard's gone, you've got a replacement, and you're thinking, where do I position this? Well, actually, if you don't know, the simplest way to do it on all of these is to, let's see if I can zoom out and show you. I mean, it is always the simplest way, but let's say you've got a long ruler, you know what your scale length is, and you start with this is the worst ruler to do it on this bench because I always end up tipping over the edge. So assume that I've got no frets and no fingerboard on there. Well, I know this is we're pretending it's a Gibson Les Paul, right? I know it's a 6/28 millimeter scale, right? So I can go to here. I know I'm going to play a little game. Pretend that's what's happened, right? So I'm going to go to here, and I'm going to place my long ruler on the 6/28 mark on the apex of the high E, which is usually a good start point. Each string length ultimately is slightly longer than that, but it's never shorter in my experience. I don't think it ever is. Not for standard strings of the kind we buy and use all the time. So a good guide is to go with your scale length, your 6/28 mark, and place it right on the saddle. And assuming that your saddles are in plenty of room, you don't want to do this measurement noticing that the saddles are crammed right at the back. You don't want them right at the front. You want them somewhere comfortably in their range, and if they aren't there, set them in their range, right? So we've got this Gibson with no fingerboard. We go 6/28 to there, and we follow it back up here, and we mark it on our neck at the beginning here, and that is our nut mark. Now obviously this is a movable fingerboard, but let's pretend it was the mark on your actual raw neck. And with that, you obviously mark it to there. And then when you get your new fingerboard on, you can see where the nut starts, wherever it is, and you line up with there. And you can then place it, stick it down with some tape, double check it, make sure you're comfortably within that scale length for that type of guitar. So if you're, there's a lot of, and there's not really a question in the Q&As about this, but a guitar, I often say when you're going to make your first guitars, and I'm no expert in this, here's just what I've learned the hard way. When you come to make your own first guitars, simplify everything you can, because the experience of making a guitar that's sweet to play is infinitely more motivating than failing slightly on an exquisitely looking expensive guitar that cost you a ton in parts but never felt like you wanted to play it afterwards, right? There's nothing worse than that. And part of that is to keep it simple. So, for example, this bridge, this type of bridge, or alternatively a hardtail Strat style bridge. I don't think I've got any kicking around here because I've shoved them all along. Oh, no, that's this Tele bridge. Anyway, I've got some somewhere, but this kind of top fixed bridge with individual saddles that have a long range of adjustment, that is the most forgiving type of bridge. And there's two reasons why. One is obviously the scale length can be altered quite substantially. A Tunematic bridge has less adjustment room than the distance between this screw here and the front of the saddle. That is more than the entire range you get on a Tunematic bridge. They're totally unforgiving in that adjustability range, and they're also totally unforgiving in the side to side. If you get side to side wrong on a Tunematic bridge, you have to pull out the plug, the bridge studs, fill them with dowels, hardwood dowels, make hardwood dowels, fill them again, remark up, gauge, get the strings lined up exactly in the right place, and try again. And if you're 1 millimeter out of line either side, it can ruin the whole playability. This type of bridge, on the other hand, not only has it got all the saddle movement room, but it's also got, if you get it wrong and you go, oh, how did I get it? It's now off to one side. Well, take it up, fill those little holes in with smaller dowels, reposition your bridge on there by hand. This time, put tape under, draw around it, make sure you get the thing in exactly the right place with the guide strings on there going down. And your second go, you'll get it right. And beautifully, the mistakes will be hidden underneath there. Not with a Tunematic bridge. As soon as you get it wrong with that, which you will, your bridge repairs, your post repairs, or your fills and re-drills will be visible to either side of the post. So, want to make it simple. If you're starting off with this, stick to the simplest things. So that's just kind of a general thing. But for Martin, main pitfalls of attaching a fingerboard isn't actually difficult, really. You want to make sure that you don't, if you're putting a new one on, you don't want the truss rod to be filled up with glue, so you need to put a strip down the middle covering the truss rod, but you don't want it so that it takes up any more than necessary of the stickable surface where you're going to put your new fingerboard onto. And then probably the hardest thing after that is making sure your clamping is thorough enough that it covers all the length of the fingerboard, for which it's often easier to take the neck off if you can, but if you can't, you have to be, if it's a Les Paul, which this isn't, but imagine that's a set neck guitar, you've got to be comfortable clamping from behind the body onto there to make sure it's held on. You need it to stick all the way down, but you also have to be careful not to squeeze so hard, and that's another beginner mistake, is to squeeze furiously hard on your clamps and squeeze all of the glue out of it, so almost nothing is left. So that is my answer to Martin's question, and there's the answer to the question of Martin's. All right, so when I get onto this next question, I will start masking this off, which terrifies me, but I will do it anyway because we've got to do it, and then I will also make sure I've got some thin bits. If this finish decides it's going to come off, it's going to come off, and that's all there is to it. I have no real control. Just have to believe that it's got enough stickability at this point in time to remain on. I'm using as low tack stuff, tape as I can. Right, Adam's question. This is a serious question, but I know he's thrown it in as a hand grenade to get me beaten up by all the aficionados. Adam says, what woods are best for tone? Are tone woods a myth? What is the best wood to do work? Actually, there's three questions. What woods are best for tone? Okay, I'm going to be absolutely straight with you. And this is what I advise when you're asked a question. If you're doing guitar work, you're asked a question you don't really know a completely convincing, hard and fast answer to, like this one. And I'll tell you what I know, but I'll phrase it in my limitations rather than in grandiose, I'm clever and I know all of this. I will say, in answer to your question, Adam, what woods are best for tone? I will say, if we're talking just about electric guitars, I have no idea. Okay? Simple as that. I have no idea. I am not clever enough or experienced enough, or my ears are not sensitive or tuned or trained or whatever they have to be enough to make a meaningful stab at that, answering that question. So one way of putting it is, I like playing any kind of guitar made of any kind of wood. And in fact, I like playing any kind of guitar made of any kind of material, mostly, right? So I've always described myself as promiscuous when it comes to guitars. I just like them because they're guitars, right? And you can say, oh, that's because you're a Luddite and you have no idea about tone woods. And no, I don't. So what are the best tone woods for electric guitars? I don't really think the wood itself, this is just my experience, and it could be completely wrong. My experience suggests that the wood itself doesn't colour the tone of doesn't affect the tone of the guitar. Now, I know a lot of people have a lot of belief riding on that it does, and my view on that comes partly from my own limited experience, which says, to be honest, I couldn't tell. I could tell. Here's the thing: I could tell you a single coil pickup when I hear one, probably, and I could probably tell you a humbucker when I hear one. That's about as clever as I get, right? I could not tell you a piece of maple, I couldn't tell you a maple strat, or an alder strat from a ash one. In terms of just hearing the notes, right? I could probably tell you Fender made single coil pickups from a generic budget brand ones. I could probably tell you which were the pricier ones, but I wouldn't even get that right all the time because there are so many variations. So I'm not anywhere near clever enough to answer that question. What I do know, with my scientisty logical thinking head on, is that as yet I've never heard a convincing hypothesis, and remember, I've been over this many times in videos, but I've never heard anyone put together a coherent hypothesis that explains, even in vaguely understandable layman terms, how alder makes its way, the intrinsicness of alder makes, or how any defined quality of alder makes its way into the pickups and out to the amp and to my ears, right? And I'm not saying it doesn't, but curiously, nobody has ever been able to tell me a convincing hypothesis about how it happens. Now, I've been given by people over time a ton of obscure, self-indulgent scientific papers, okay? And you've all seen one of them where somebody slaps it there in the forum debate and goes, proof that there's Tonewood, and that's the end of it for them. They've plonked this thing in because it's got a paper, an abstract title, and it's got a research department, behind it or whatever of some university, or it's some bigwig who knows about sound, then they believe it. And I've looked at that and I go, well, if there is an argument in there that tells me how some specific quality of wood A affects the tone coming out of amplifier B, then he's failed to convert it to any kind of common sense language that would hope in any way to communicate itself to me. Now, academics then would sometimes say, well, that's your deficit. You don't have enough intelligence to know, or you're not learned enough to understand the argument I put forward. And I would say, bull. If you're that clever, you would find a way to paraphrase it or summarize it such that a person like me could be saved from the endless misery of being caught up in this endless Tonewood argument. And quite strangely, nobody ever has. So, with that sort of that stance in mind, Adam, you troublemaker, do I think the Tonewood has an effect? There is such a thing as Tonewood for guitars. There might be. I don't. For electric guitars, there might be. I don't know. If I can't perceive it, then there practically isn't. And it could be my fault, my lack. But as far as I can tell, I've never been able to tell any difference in tone such that I could go, oh God, I'm playing an older Strat. Yes, of course you are, Sam. I could tell you if I saw the grain, but if you covered it all over and strapped some lead to it to mess up the weight and whatever, took away all of those cues, I couldn't tell you, oh yes, that's definitely American older, yes, you can hear the snappy twanginess and blah, 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 blah. That, you would never hear me doing or saying that. So, my honest answer is, might be, but nobody's ever given me even the beginnings of a coherent, and by coherent, as I stated, it means understandable, not by a rocket scientist, and coherent, easily understandable argument about how and why. Not just why, but how it works. What is the mechanism? You can't just say it does. Right? Remember I said before, that's an opinion. So, Adam, it might do, but nobody who seems to think it does has ever managed to put together an argument that even helps me understand the way by which they think it does, far less show any evidence that proves that it does. And you've got to remember that both those things are necessary in proving something to somebody else. You've got to argue how it happens, and then you've got to show proof under experimental conditions that it does actually happen. And neither of these things, and all the things that you've been told in the past that everyone else seems to believe in but you feel bad not believing in, I'll bet you those same two things apply, that nobody's ever explained to you, given you a coherent argument about how this thing's supposed to make a difference, Tonewood, far less then go on to show you coherent, repeatable experiments that demonstrate the truth of that point or that argument that they made, that Tonewood affects the sound in this way for these scientific reasons. Nobody ever goes that far. They just shout, yes, it does, and you're stupid and you're wrong and you're not experienced enough. So I'm always all ears, but Adam, no, I don't think it does. But I could be completely wrong, as I have been about many things in the universe. Life, money, success, you name it. Anyway, I think I will dispense with the other parts of your question. Are Tonewoods a myth? Well, first of all, not in acoustic guitars they're not. Tonewoods are critical for acoustic guitars. They flap about with vibrations, and that vibration of the flapping of the soundboard pushes sound waves directly to your ears. So there's the simple mechanism by which it happens. I'd still want to see a coherent argument why Sitka spruce makes a warmer type of response than a blah, 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 right? I'd like to know some of the science underneath that in such a way that I could understand it. But even the bit of the argument where it says different woods will vibrate differently, okay, and that vibration is the only thing that produces the sound, unlike the pickup in the electric guitar, which produces 99% of the sound that you hear if it's amplified, then I've got a pretty good workable understanding. Okay, so I go with it that Sitka spruce has a certain way of vibrating, which under certain conditions, with certain kinds of strings, for certain kinds of music, will suit it better than others. Okay, buy it. It's half, the argument's half explained. What is the best wood to do work? I think whatever you want to work with. and it's more than just this. I mean, let's only talk about electric guitars. There's two ways of looking at it. Well, really, there's whatever. If you're going to paint the guitar, you can choose, or you can work with loads of different kinds of woods. You can find woods that are good to work, or soft enough to work with, hard enough not to dent, but actually boring to look at, and so you wouldn't want to sort of present them as a what do you call it, a natural finish. You'd probably more likely, they're so dreary looking, you'd want to do something either, people probably put sunburst on them to make them look interesting, or cover them flat colours. So if I'm going to make something, there's a wood, poplar, for example, which is what, sycamore? No, is it like sycamore? Anyway, poplar is fairly relatively cheap. Poplar is perfectly good for making a solid body guitar with electric guitar with a solid colour. Right? It takes the paint perfectly well. It doesn't matter. You can make it with 7 slices for all anyone cares. In fact, the guitar's stronger if you make it with 7 slices, probably. So you can make it with loads of slices, and nobody will see it. If the wood's all dried, it's all the same stock, then it won't kind of suddenly dry at different rates. But you can get a beautifully finished solid colour guitar out of a very dreary, boring, but fairly inexpensive wood. Obviously, there are other woods that are visually more attractive, and some that are so beautiful that you pay a fortune for, like some burls, for example, those kind of weird malformations on trees that, when you cut them up, look like a cross section of some kind of psychedelic brain gone mad. Anyway, those are really they can be really expensive, like oak burr or apple woods and olive woods and things can be really expensive, and there can be some problems with working them. But you sort of have to weigh up the kind of weight you're looking for in the guitar. You have to weigh up, do you want to show a natural finish, in which case you might want it to be a bit more interesting than a poplar. So it really comes down to what you want the thing to look like at the end. And why pay for an expensive, good-looking grain when you're never going to see it? So in terms of what's the best wood, I've worked on. I started out making guitars out of oak for fun because not many people had. I know Brian May used it in his, but the first thing I think I read was people saying it's far too heavy. You can't make a guitar out of oak. Sounds terrible. It's an awful tone wood, and I made all my guitars out of oak just because of that. I was feeling ornery, you might say. I'm not convinced of including this 180 step in this. I put it in, I added this to the sanding process, but I'm not sure. I think I'll stick to what I had before, which is the 240 to 400. Anyway, I'll carry on talking even though this is a bit noisy. So, Adam, anything you want to work with, depending on whether you want it to be a natural finish or whether you're going to paint it. Like I say, the good thing about painting is that you discover that you can use multiple part bodies, and you can pretty much make a guitar body out of almost as many chunks of wood as you've got left in your wood pile. And that's if it's the same material and it's all dried out enough and so on. You don't want it to be drying at different rates. That's the main concern. But you have you don't even have to go out and find good looking one piece or two piece bodies. Some people would argue, it's a one piece body and therefore it must transmit tone better, and that's part of the tone wood nonsense. And if anyone says that to you, try just ask them in a very polite and genuine spirit of inquiry. Keep the contempt as low on as low a heat as possible. But when they talk about, I want there, I don't want there to be a joint in this wood because, a tone. Then ask them, tell me how tone is damaged, please, by this being a 3-part body, or tell me how tone gets worse for a 3-part than a 2-part, or worse for a 5-part body than for a 2-part body? You know, give me an argument about how that happens, and then show me some experiments if you can. And they won't be able to, because it's a supposition. So Adam, whatever you've got, whatever you want to build it in, that will teach you something. That's what I would say. I think the main thing to be conscious of, and this gets a bit noisy now, the main thing to be conscious of is it's very easy to end up with very heavy guitars, and certain kinds of woods naturally will lead you to a heavy guitar in the end if you're not very, very careful. And by careful, I mean if you're not careful about the wood you use, very quickly you can find yourself with something that's heading to the 8-pound region, particularly if you want a full thickness body like this Tele. For a single piece of wood, that can be actually harder than simple, if you get what I mean. It's harder than you think to get a kind of wood that will give you this thickness with no chambering and still be light enough. So it's quite difficult. This, you know, they use, I mean, basswood, or whatever, basswood, basswood. That's always been a popular wood because it's got that very light quality and it's hard enough to be a guitar body wood and so on. But a lot of people, when they start out, sort of go looking for woods like sapele, which is African mahogany, and in doing so you can, you know, it's a lovely wood, it's got a nice grain as well, it comes up beautifully with oil, but can be very heavy very quickly. So if you find a heavy wood that you like and you're determined to use, then one of the first things you'd have to do is work on designing some chambering into it, which obviously means you have to have the body split in two longwise, so you can have a solid top and then some chambering in the bottom section. Some people have chambering in the top section too if they're equal thing, but that's more complicated. So yeah, best wood to work is probably lighter, but if you go above a certain lightness, you get soft. The wood seems to get softer and certainly less substantial, and it doesn't feel great, and it dents easily, and so on. And then sometimes you get guitars that are made from some of the lightest woods you can find. And for example, I got one here. If I can just bring this out, and this is very naughty. This is what some manufacturers and some private sellers buy and then try and sell on and call swamp ash. It's nothing of the sort. It's a wood that's loosely known as candle nut, and it is just about almost hard enough to use as a guitar body, especially if you don't mind denting it very easily. But it's so far softer than I would like, but it's light as a feather. And actually, this is a full thickness. Is it? No, it's just slightly under. But you know, it gives you a fairly big size body, chunky body. But that would be overwhelmed by the headstock. Any neck that I put on it would be far too heavy for that particular body. So it's just horrible. But it's cheap as chips. And like I say, I've seen people buying these off AliExpress and so on, or you know, sellers in the UK have got them in bulk from China. And those blackguards put them on eBay and call it swamp ash, which it is not. Swamp ash is a diminishing material. This is swamp ash, and it's expensive, and it's much denser and harder by miles than that. I mean, it has a superficial similarity, right? But it has a much nicer grain, as you can probably make out there. Anyway, but it isn't. That stuff is candle nut, whatever the Chinese actual name of it is. Who knows? But it's a horrible thing. So that's the Tonewood thing. You know, and by contrast, a guitar that you did put together with that stuff can make a great fun guitar to play. It's not dependent on the weight, but you don't want to get something. I personally prefer something with a bit of Heft, I certainly don't want it being overpowered by the neck as a almost without fail, which you will get with that candle nut stuff. Okay, so I am officially done with Tonewood, Adam. Thank you very much. Now, Johnny, a friend of my brother's called Johnny Edwards, who runs a podcast or a vlog himself called The Budget Guitar Show on YouTube. He says, what has been the worst budget brand you've had to work on, and how bad was it? It's a funny question, that. Well, it's an interesting question, because if you didn't focus it on brands, which is the worst brand, and you just left it as what were the worst guitars you ever worked on, I would have one set of stories for you, and they would actually often include or involve the customer as well as the guitar, because there are occasions when the customer and the guitar can come from hell, and it's not the customer's fault, it's nobody's fault, it's just a mismatch in maybe expectations. But in that context, the guitar itself can become a hound of hell itself. It becomes hateable, and it probably colours everything I've ever worked on with the same brand on it. But Johnny keeps it, because of his own show interest, he keeps it to the brand question. And there are loads, obviously there are loads. I've got to say, before I answer the question or go into any details, this thing about answering the question, any brand that I can give you as being awful, or any particular model of a brand that I can tell you as being more or less awful that I've come across, I can come across another one then a week later which makes a lie out of it, proves the lie or whatever. And I can find one that I just love playing, and I go, why the hell is this so good? And I will never know. And on paper it should be hated like all the other ones. So it's never absolute, that's the first thing. And for all I know, it could have to do with the time in the day, or the part of the year we're in, or the fact that the sun just came out and I got bad or good news, and I suddenly think, this funny old piece of crap that I'm knocking about with here is the best guitar I've ever had, and I actually think it's better than all of the expensive ones, and so on. So nothing is fixed, is what I'm trying to say. But there are some general things, and some of them, I'm going to mention a couple which were budget brands. In fact, one was a budget brand, and I think actually one person who's put I'm not going to say who it is, because I'm going to lash out at it a bit, so I won't embarrass one person who might read this who's had experience without their permission. But there's a brand here that I've seen that I thought was diabolically crap, and it was anything but a budget brand. It set itself up as a premium brand, and it was anything but. Anyway, we'll come to that. Must not let me go past it and forget. So there are obvious ones that come to mind. What's the worst brands? People go, oh God, do you remember the K guitars? Well, I'll tell you one brand that should never have even had a factory consider making it, or when the first one rolled off the factory production line, it should have been strangled, burned, the whole a sinkhole should have opened up underneath the factory and swallowed it all. And it was whoever made guitars for Sue Ryder, the charity shop, right? What did they call them? They had a name, didn't they? I can't even remember. It's so bad, I've put it. You'll know, some of you will know straight away what it is. It's so awful that thankfully I've expunged it from my memory. God, it's going to come back to me, isn't it? No, it's not. Anyway, Sue Ryder charity shop guitars. There was a brand that you'd see in there, and they were worse. They are the most, and they're only ever acoustic guitars, thank the Lord, I think. But they were by far and away the worst jokes of a guitar ever to make the British High Street. That's what I would say. And if ever I saw somebody who had one of these, I know the name's going to come to me and it's going to be horrible. Anyway, if ever I saw anyone who had one of these, I'd just say burn it, get rid of it. Go and buy a £50 Harley Benton or a £80 Harley Benton, do not waste any more time playing this. There's nothing to do to save it. So that's the first one, Sue Ryder's brand, whatever it was. Of course, there are loads that you can go and find from on eBay from AliExpress, and they will have all kinds of completely forgettable, stupid Western sounding, no, not even Western sounding brand names. The Japanese used to do a nice line in the 80s of the 70s and 80s or 80s, 90s of cute sounding misuse of English names just because it sounded cute. Hey Kitty, you know, that kind of thing. I'm insulting the Hello Kitty because they were quite good, but anyway. But it used to be a Japanese thing to repurpose a British phrase, but even the Chinese guitar makers don't do that. They seem to put like 30 letters together from the English alphabet that doesn't make any sense at all, and then they make terrible guitars that fall apart as soon as they arrive in this storage warehouse, distribution warehouse in the UK, and you get them, and the kid you bought them for cries on his birthday because the fingerboard's already bent like a Hot Wheels loop-the-loop, and the cheap top of the guitar is separated from the sides, and it's just unplayable and horrible, and they never want to see a guitar again, and you've ruined their guitar career. So there's an unspeakable number of those things, but I don't really consider them because you can't even name them. They're so forgettable. They don't have memorable names. There are some things around, some of the worst ones. I've got to settle on something. One of the worst type I ever came across was the Marlin Sidewinder, which, not all of them, but the East German made one. Now, young people don't even know, really. There was a place called East Germany, and if you're under a certain age, East Germany was a dark and fascinating place, rather like Russia is today. But East Germany was, to all intents and purposes, just a communist satellite of, that brings me to another brand, a communist satellite of Russia or Soviet Union. So when you take apart a Marlin Sidewinder from East Germany, it has a whole load of weird and slightly mysterious components that take you back to the scary dark days of the, when we were about to be nuked and go through mutually assured destruction. Do you remember those old days years ago when that was a possibility? Anyway, so yeah, the East German Marlin Sidewinder was one of those. And the reason it was so bad is that everyone I've ever come across, the neck is always bent beyond any saving. So, and what was kind of insulting or frustrating about the Marlin Sidewinders, even the non-East German ones, I can't remember where, Chinese was the next location, I think, but the Marlin Sidewinder, it looked pretty good. It often had a quite a cool vintage retro looking maple fingerboard that, you caught your eye, and many a foolish person like me would go, oh, I've got to have one. Oh, come on, it looks so sexy, that late 70s looking Strat, and oh look, it's in cream color, and the fingerboard's blonde, and the plastics are all slightly aged and yellowing. So we bought them, and then they just ended up in the bin because you couldn't play them. And then once you couldn't play them, you realized that you couldn't really find a neck that would fit the pocket, and so you kind of held on to it for a while thinking maybe there'll come a time when and it ended up, the body went in the bin as well because it wasn't really worth fighting to save, because nothing about it was very standard. Anyway, so the Marlin Sidewinder is one. I have to mention the Satellites, and the Satellite has a special place in my dark heart, because the Satellite was my first electric guitar. Before that, I think I had only ever had, my interest in guitaring was probably peaked a bit with a classical guitar when I was about 6. And eventually, when I got to be about 15 or 16, suddenly guitars were quite interesting because it was punk and everybody was starting to do some stuff, and everyone wanted to be in on it. So I wanted to be in on it, and my dad wasn't a keen supporter of me playing guitar. So when I asked him if he would kind of stand me kind of on a pocket money finance deal to get a guitar, the answer was a resounding no. Sob. Anyway, so having been told an absolute no, the guy I was sort of in a band with, or starting to try and be in a band with, very kindly got his mum to agree, because it was only 50 quid and she had a catalogue, and so she agreed that I would give her the money week by week or whatever, and she would buy it for me. And lo and behold, she did. And I don't know how I came to the decision. Well, probably based on, well, what guitars are available in the Grattan catalogue this season? And it was obviously a limited number. And in those days, it was something like either you had a few Ks, different Ks, probably it might have been a sort of one of those malevolent-looking K plywood Les Paul style flavoured things, or it was the Satellite had a similar, I think they had a similar Les Paul style thing in the catalogue, and I think probably, I don't even know why, maybe because of my liking Pink Floyd, somewhere around that time, I probably foolishly went for what looked like a Strat. And so I ordered it, and the thing came, and to my slight horror, even at that age, I seem to remember being horrified that this thing came, and it was evidently smaller than a real guitar. So it was probably about 3/4 size, if that. And I don't think it took me long to realise that in all manner of ways it was anything but a quality guitar that could be even likened to a Strat. Its resemblance to a Strat was purely in passing. Anyhow, the bottom line was that that's all I had, and I had to get on and play this guitar. And I hated that guitar. I mean, yeah, actually, I hated it. I had no choice. I played it. The action was a mile high. It wouldn't stay in tune. I have a sort of a bitter, I was going to say bittersweet, but actually I'll just leave it at bitter. I had a bitter memory of playing it in the first inverted commas gig we ever played, which was at my friend's house, and we played some Beatles songs, and to my horror there exists still a tape of that, which one of the guys actually sent me before a couple of years ago, and I'd kept the tape myself for years. You know, I was the one who kept it, and then I'd made a copy for someone. I think I'd ditched my version of the tape in sort of disgust, hoping never to see it again. And one of the guys sort of said, "Oh, I've still got that tape of us playing in so-and-so's front room." I was like, "Oh." And of course, by that time you go, "Oh, please send it, I've got to see this." So lo and behold, he sended it, and I got to see it, hear it, and it's awful. Truly awful. I never would put it anywhere near YouTube or anything like that. And you're going to hear my hideous Satellite 65T 3/4 sized pretend Stratocaster grinding away out of tune, slightly out of tune. Not just the guitar's fault, and me grinding away badly out of tune, all at the same time. So, and that guitar, you know, it was. You've seen the ones. You can go online and look at them. To this day now, old blokes of my age are trying to flog them, and they're so cheeky that they go, "Oh yeah, true vintage Japanese, made in Japan quality." They've seen someone somewhere else saying how good made in Japan is, so they use the same terminology, thinking it will get them a sale. Truth is that they were made in Japan in a period where Japanese-made guitars were almost universally vile. It was the days when I remember when I was young kid, made in Japan was the joke. You know, we'd joke at something being absolutely trashy. Made in Japan. Now that recently it's become a bit more like we say that about made in China. But when I was young, it was made in Japan stood for it. Then made in Hong Kong became the thing that took over. And then in the intervening period, made in Japan became a very strong indicator of quality guitar making, without a doubt. But in my day, early days, made in Japan was no guarantee of anything. In fact, almost the opposite. So, yeah, I guess I lived with my Satellite 65T for a while, and it gets a bit fuzzy there, because I guess teenage memories do get very fuzzy, because alcohol usually gets discovered about that time, and played in a couple of sort of gigs here and there, which we were awful, of course, and I think I remember getting sick of the guitar, and not surprisingly, and I remember in disgust I buried it. Oh no, first of all I took the neck off, and I painted the body with house paint, just to make it, because it had this awful shitty sunburst colour, which showed the crappy veneer wood that it was made of. So I'm going to need to use the power driver to do this. It will take forever. Yeah, it was ugly. So I think I did it out of sheer boredom. So I kind of got some household emulsion or some totally unsuitable paint, and I painted this guitar. And I think by that time I'd given up any hope of ever playing it again. I think also at that time skateboarding had probably taken over as the thing I was doing. But anyway, so painted it, hated it, knocked it around, and I think I finally took the neck off it. I think something happened and it stopped being playable at all. I think it was probably the wiring. It had a couple of little on and off switches for the pickups, like the Brian May kind of had, which no other guitar quite had. Anyway, it was so vile that I took the neck off the body, and I think I burned the body, but I planted the neck in the woods near my home because I hated it that much. And that was the end of the Satellite 65T. And, you know, for years, like I say, I keep seeing people who find one in their attic trying to flog them for a couple of £100. And I finally resolved to buy one, only for about £40, and I found a cheap one. And I bought one because I wanted to, just for old time's sake, just see how bad it really was. And yeah, I tried to do my best. It was a good few years ago now. Maybe I could do better with it. But at the time, I gave it my best shot. And it went down as, at that time, and probably still is, the only guitar I could not improve. Well, I did improve it. You could play it as a fun knockabout guitar, to be honest. But it was the only guitar I couldn't make playable, and I didn't mind admitting it. That was it. I'd had it with that guitar. It became legendary because it was the only guitar I couldn't improve in any significant way. So I use it as the go-to exemplar of a guitar that is so bad that even I can't improve it. So that was that. The Satellite. And Satellite had a few guitars, and accidentally one of them was quite interesting, which was a thing with a through neck, and it was made of solid woods, which was in itself a kind of, no plywood? I forgot to say the 65T was pure 100% plywood, and then even the fingerboard was painted like a light wood that was painted dark, try and make it look rosewoodish or something. But Satellite did, I have to say that the 65T, their attempted Stratocaster, was the worst of all guitars. And the one they did with the laminated neck through was actually not altogether too bad. It was badly set up and hard to play, but actually as a construction it was much more worth fighting for than the 65T, which was just worth burning or burying as I did. And Satellite, I've had a couple of Satellite plywood Les Paul style guitars through over the years, and they're quite fun to restore or refret or upgrade, but they are, when all said and done, still hideous Satellites. And the best thing they've got going for them is their mojo. So I think in a review of brands that are awful, sometimes people would expect you to fill in with certain brands like, they'd expect to hear Encore as a brand, something like that, because Encore is a guitar brand that's, I think, unfairly despised. And actually what it is, it's the go-to put-down brand that people who think they know it all and are kind of ensnared into the dream world of, oh yeah, I know what a good brand is and yours is shit, as people seem to like to do, tend to sort of default to talking about, now which way round should this be? Damn, I've forgotten now. It's this way round. Yeah, they kind of seem to default to slagging off Encore. Now, what's true is that Encore was always intended as a budget brand, and it's a John Hornby Squier brand, and it's been through a few iterations over its time. And I would say that today, the Encore, the Chinese factory-made Encore, is a fairly so-so creature. I don't rate the Chinese version once, the Chinese version much. By that I mean the sort of how would you describe it? A ubiquitous black, or what colour do they make men? Black, or that's about it. They're mostly black and white. Ubiquitous black Encore Strat style guitar, and they are dreary. But as with all John Hornby Squier's products, the guitars, the necks are surprisingly good for such a, considering that they're a basic thing. And actually I've always quite liked the JHS necks, and I've used them on many a project for that reason. They're nothing special, but they're actually a lot better than they ought to be. But having said that, the Encore Strat, Chinese default model Strat, is a very unforgettable beast. And the people who are slagging it off are right in the sense that its pickups are, I would describe them as thoroughly anonymous most of the time. And that's a shame, because the necks, as I say, are perfectly okay. The bodies are lightweight. They don't feel good to me, but again, that's just a personal thing. They may be a perfect solution for somebody who's got, problems with excessive weight. They don't want to be carrying around a heavy guitar. I totally get it, that could work for people. But I will say that the Encore has produced some interesting things over the years, and some that I really rate, and I know I'm not alone in this. There's a kind of fan club of people who like the Encore guitars that were made for a period of time in Japan. In India, I should say. And this was, strict chronologies are hard to find. Sounds like a Vogelsharky song. But they're hard to find. But there was a period in time where Encore moved its production to India. It was around about the same sort of time that at the exact same factory, Fender was licensing the factory to produce Strat-like guitars under its Fender Musical Instrument Corporation label or header, under license for them. And they were almost identical, these Encore Strats and the Sun Mustang, so-called, well, they weren't called Strats, they were just called Sun Mustangs, but they were very similar guitars, and they shared the same neck practically, and very similar body from the same materials, and they were actually a surprisingly good, I think, a really great Strat. And they were always misunderstood, although people who had them to this day, I think, still recognise that they had something of an unusual quality, especially when you compared it certainly to the cheap budget, some of the cheap budget Strats of today. Like, there are brands going around like Glary and kind of anonymous things like that. So Encore, people think it's the worst guitar brand. Actually, an encore neck is almost always a good neck. What you'll find is and the Indian ones are better than good. They're quite likable in a surprising sort of way. They have a real sort of vintage quality feel to them. If I can actually try and get this thing to go in here, very difficult. So what else? So that's not even going to go through. So other brands. People. There is a question later on, actually. Two questions. Mike Taylor asks me about the ERT guitar, and Mark Rickard asked me about the Swift Les Paul copies. And I have to say, I don't think I've had either of those through. I may have had a Swift, and I've heard about the ERT ones, but honestly, I don't really know anything about them as far as commenting on them. I think that what I would say is, and it ties back into this question again that Johnny asked and somebody else asks about separately, is that there are brands that came out for a while like Westfield, which have made some really good quality things, like some of their Les Paul copies that actually were surprisingly good quality builds. So it's no just because they're not very well known, there's no guarantee that they're not good quality. They can be quite surprising. And Westfield, for example, I just did one recently. They had a sort of, I think it was the top of their line in their Les Pauls. Their regular ones, like their Strats and Teles, were a little bit sort of bland, but they were solid quality despite that. And their Les Pauls were the same, a little bit unremarkable. They seem to specialise in black colour and tuxedo-y style, but a bit like this one here. But what they did was they made a top of the range-ish one in what colour was it? It was like a honey burst type of colour, and they called it the I think it was E4500. And it was a great guitar, and I picked one up a few years ago for £90, and did it up, and I couldn't fault it. I thought that was as good a Les Paul copy as you'd get. Had beautiful mother of pearl or abalone inserts, and the fret markers, square fret markers, just a lovely thing. So, I think the bottom line is, Johnny, that when it comes to budget guitars, it has an awful lot to do with your preconceptions. I don't mean yours personally, because you're doing a show called Budget Guitar Show, so I know straight away, I get the feeling straight away that you have a lot of time for finding the good that's there without being, blinded by the name. So, as I do, that there are some great quality things. But I think if you ask me, are there certain guitars that I would definitely go for every time without fail, that I would confident, I would say there are some. For example, one of the ones I've recommended regularly and caused a bit of a rush on the banks, if you like, was the Rallies. And Rally is a kind of Far East brand that just plays into the budget guitar market. I don't quite know. They don't really sell directly to the UK exactly. They have some distribution deals, but anyway, they're a bit mysterious. But to cut the long story short, Rally made an entire range of every shape you could imagine, as a lot of these Chinese factories do. I think it was a Korean-owned company, but Chinese production, and they made every shape possible, of which I've seen about 10 different models in my time. But the one that I happened to get hold of first, and which caught my attention, was their model called a GL300, which was their Les Paul style guitar. And this thing came with what I immediately could tell was amazing condition frets, and I was able to set an action on this thing straight away. It benefited from a little bit of extra work, which I always wanted to do to kind of perfect it, but standing alone, it was clearly a cut above. And I thought, I thought maybe I got lucky, and then I saw another one and tried another one, and it turned out very quickly that all of the Strat style models that they made seemed, no, Strat style, most of the GL, in fact all of the GL 300s and the GL 400 they made, which was very similar, and also a Les Paul copy style. All of them just were incredibly good quality, and I think the thing that swung it for me was not just the playability, because actually in truth you can make a good Westfield probably play as well, although they did seem to be, coming out of the factory, better set up than I'd seen just about anything else. But what really I think made it for me straight off was the sound the pickups made on top of the great action, and the pickups were amazing sounding stock pickups, which made me think, actually, this is an amazing package. So I sort of started to sing their praises, and of course before long certain people took me up on it and ended up buying every bloody Rally that ever comes up now on eBay. And the only regret I have about Rally GL 300s is that I never kept one for myself. I did for a while, and I gigged a bit with one for a little while, and then I was sort of over-equipped with my own double humbucker guitars, and I sort of let it go, when money calls and stuff. But yeah, I became the only person I had turned on to Rallies who didn't have one. Anyhow, so that was a good brand. But that's not what Johnny asked. But it kind of ties in a bit with Johnny's, Mike's, and Mark's question. There were a couple of guitars I wanted to mention specifically, and neither of these were classed as budget guitars, but what they were, I think, incredibly cynical, exploitative online tricks, and I might get told off for this, but I can only speak as I find. There was a brand of guitar that out of the blue suddenly started, the brand suddenly started contacting people. Not me. I noticed they were contacting people that I was watching, or owners, players, people that had some guitar playing channels mainly. And this company's name sounded like "Hey Nonny Nonny." It was a completely made up word, a silly sounding word in English, and I sort of took an interest because it looked suspicious to me, and it kind of seemed to be talking about a fairly expensive range of guitars, which caught my eye because to me they looked absolutely bog standard sort of kit put together guitars. So this company had a whole splash, and it claimed that all these great musicians were using its guitars, and you could have one now for this reduced price of XYZ if you got in quick enough and did XYZ enough. And so I sort of watched them closely for a while, and it turned out to be a Russian company operating out of Vladivostok, can you believe? And what I noticed they did was that they appealed to all male guitar playing channels who they basically put I've said this to the person whose guitar I worked on, and this is before I worked on this guitar, by the way. I had reservations about this brand, and I could see straight away. I've been involved in scams and manipulative things, and I don't mean doing it to people. I kind of spent some of my spare time scam busting a while ago. I'm quite good at spotting scamulous things, and this looks scamulous to me. And this brand its modus operandi was to appeal to the egos of people running their channels and showing how to play certain stuff, and it quite understandably made them feel special, because it contacted them and said, "Hey, we love your channel and your playing. Would you like to be a product ambassador for one? We think you're good enough to be a product." Straight away it's the appeal to the ego sort of thing going on. You're just the kind of talented musician we want to to get on board as one of our ambassadors. And what they did is their deal, they offered to, if you wanted to work with them, they offered to let you, or to sell you one of their top-notch guitars, RRP, normally millions of quid, for a bargain price of not millions of quid, but still actually about the 600 quid mark, gulp, in order to for you to basically be you'd be a brand ambassador. And the thing you had to do was agree to it. They'd sell you the guitar, they'd ship it to you, and you'd play it. And because you were so chuffed to be there, endorsed, they called it, we've endorsed you. You were their endorsed player, that you put on a review. And in truth, I thought, oh God, this is not great, because I looked at these reviews that I saw, and almost nobody was saying, well, not almost, nobody was saying anything critical. And I kept looking at these guitars thinking, what is there in this that is 700 or whatever it was quid? I couldn't find anything to that that would make it that price. So it had me kind of concerned. And then a customer came to me and said, oh look, I've got a guitar, can I send down to you to set up? And I'd done setups for this customer before, and then he mentioned the name of this brand of guitar, and I was, of course, oh God, I said to him, I'd be interested to, but I'll probably be honest about what I find, but also just genuinely interested to see if I was right or wrong, and was this actually a good guitar worthy of all the self-promotion puff it was giving itself. Anyway, he sent the guitar down, and my first impression was, holy cow, this is so below average to start off with. I don't even know what to say. And it was, I have to say, imagine a Glary guitar, right, which is on one level, if you just stare at it long enough, it's an electric guitar. It's got a sort of a shiny gloss top to it. Kind of looks nice color. And then when you actually get into playing something as badly made as a Glary, which, by the way, Johnny comes into the thing. I don't even need to see a Glary to know how bad they are. I think I have seen one once. I can't remember. I'm sure I've seen one. Anyway, but it's a truly average, underwhelming thing from an average and underwhelming factory. And this Hey Nonny Nonny style brand was exactly that. And I thought, there's no way on God's green earth that this is a 700 quid, or what they claim to be like an 800 quid guitar, knocked down to you, special deal for you at 600 because you're an ambassador. And so I started looking anyway, I did the work on the guitar, and I had to fight this thing unbelievably hard to make it play. It was garbage, I have to say. It was, from a tech's point of view, it was awful, truly awful. And so at the same time I was going around looking, and I kept seeing all of these young people making, putting their thing on their website with a picture of this guitar, and they kind of quoted everything that the company itself said. The company sort of waxed lyrical all about, with this guitar, this top-rate guitar, the made precision, blah blah. I can't even begin to remember, but it was awful. And I started to think, have I got this so wrong, or have I just missed something, or am I just overly critical? And because nobody's saying anything bad, I can't believe that my customer just got the only one that was truly awful. And my instincts were telling me, no, you're not wrong. There's something going on here. And of course, I can never technically get to the bottom of it, but I can be almost certain that not one of these people who their egos kind of fell for the flattery, I would say, and there's no judgment about them. It's human. Who took one of these guitars, I don't think any of them were ever critical about the things, because either maybe they didn't really notice the faults the way I do, and sort of it didn't seem a ridiculous amount of money to ask to them. Or, and this is what I thought was possibly much more likely, maybe once you've kind of had your ego stroked by a company that's deliberately using your ego to sell you vastly overpriced, because even at the so-called cut price for you being their sponsor, this guitar cost a good, I would say, 300 quid overprice for what it was, an almost unplayable lump of garbage from the cheapest, about the cheapest Chinese factory you could probably get a deal with. That's what, and I know Russian mentalities as well in some ways, because I've read a lot of stuff on Russian business and ways of doing things, and it seemed to me just the kind of thing that fitted with that. And so I just thought, here's a whole thing that's designed as a clever money-making scam, really, designed entirely to play on the, well-meaning but, kind of unsuspecting egos of people who wouldn't feel good to be approached by a company and, made to feel good about their playing skills on their websites or whatever. It's very flattering, and we're human. It predisposes us to feel good about somebody when they treat us that way. Anyway, but I have to say that was it's not really an answer to your question, or Johnny, but it was a terrible guitar masquerading as a premium guitar. And what I would say that they got absolutely right was the psychology of that, because if you went entirely on what people said in their reviews, I think not one of the people who got hooked in to this guitar, I mean, some of them maybe it suited them and they didn't find it was hard to play and they were happy with it because they felt good about it or whatever. But I imagine that of any of the people that struggled to play it and realised that it wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, I bet very few, if any of them, would feel inclined to write a post saying, "This is awful. I've been had. They suckered me in because they massaged my ego, and I, like an idiot, I trusted them, and now I've got this lump of garbage that I'm stuck with." And I just think actually that had all the hallmarks of the scams that I know of that are designed exactly around knowing how people will feel. So you could call it a psychological scam. Anyway, that was a brand that was I think it still counts, because I'm not going to name it because I don't want death threats from somebody miffed, but you'll know it when you hear it, or you've probably seen it, or you may well have even been approached by them with all their flattering stuff. But that was junk. I would have advised avoiding like plague. Anyhow, I'm just, as we're doing with the Q&A, I'm just sort of finishing off these things here. Is that going to be just about right? I think that is almost spot on. Now, it's too shallow a nut slot on this one to make it adjustable, so it's going to have to be a solid one. Right, with that, let us move on to Podrig. He said, my question was similar to Johnny's, in that I was going to ask about which of the budget brands you've worked on. Yes, Podrig mentioned the Westfields and the VHS, particularly the vintage ones. Yeah. So, yeah, I think those two questions went in together. Westfield Rallies vintage. Yes, I didn't mention vintage, but, they're off the JHS family, and they I've got to say, a vintage SG style guitar is an absolutely perfect platform. For a beginner working on setups, the advantage of the vintage SG models are you can get them down to phenomenally low actions. I mean, it's not just the vintage thing, it's due to the SG where all of its neck kind of lives outside of the body. So it's very flexible, and it seems to respond in a single smooth way to the ministrations of the truss rod adjustment, whereas a guitar like even a Strat that's bolted in the neck is bolted into place, and certainly with fixed neck joint, like a no, not like an SG, but like a Les Paul, where there's a lot of the neck is, and quite a bit of the truss rod is inside the perimeter of the guitar body, then that makes the truss rod respond less flexibly. So the SG is a great one. A vintage SG is a brilliant starter guitar, and you can put all manner of pickups in it and modifications, but you know it will play beautifully low with a small amount of fretwork. Same kind of things apply. So yeah, we've covered all of that, I think, Podrick. So we've got Sid from Algeria. Greetings, Sid. I remember your posts many moons back. Hope you're well. My opinion on the Harley Benton Fusion series pros and cons. Really, it's hard for me to answer this one in too much detail. I will say that my opinion of it is getting better. I've worked on two, and I've never owned one to kind of explore living with it. Oops, I'm out of strings. Got 3 more sets of 9s coming. So this is, I'm just going to, while I'm talking, I'm going to basically complete this guitar by putting the strings on and finalising the nut slots on this. So we'll carry on. Yes, so Sid, the Fusion guitar, I have to say the first one I encountered didn't impress me, and that was because can't remember now what the tremolo was on it, but it would not return back to tune when used, so I was disappointed in it, and the customer eventually ended up sending it back and getting something else altogether, because two one after another just wouldn't stay in tune, which wasn't great. Now, having said that, it was a beautiful looking thing, and in most respects it was beautifully finished, and it was brand new at the time, and now it's been out a year or so or more probably. It's not cheap, and do I like it? I'm going to be totally honest with you, Sid. It doesn't light any of my candles, and I don't know why. And there are lots of guitars that I've had through that don't light my candles, and it could just simply be that I've not spent enough time playing them, and why would I have an opinion on them if I haven't played them and I've just worked on them or looked at them mainly. But the Fusion doesn't make me want to play it, and that is probably an unfair thing to say, because technically it's got a lot going for it. It has stainless steel frets, it's got a roasted maple fingerboard, all manner of good stuff happening for it, but it just doesn't warm my heart in any significant way, and that's a difficult one to say why. It could be the Super Strati Tele. No, this one's what was it? Whatever the shape was, I can't remember. The shape may not be the right thing for me. I know my mate Malcolm's got one that he absolutely loves, or he had. I think he sold it to. Yeah, I think he had it, loved it, and then sold it to his bandmate guitarist. But so I don't know, man. I don't know. The one I just worked on was perfectly good. The frets were improved, and I think that it's certain that Harley Benton's got better at their frets, and their overall fit and finish is, as far as I can see, is improving as the years go by, which is a great thing. It came with a quality tusk nut, which is also a great start. Unfortunately, I still had to work on it, and I ended up replacing it because we were going to go with an adjustable nut, and it was at that point I discovered that the nut slot was too shallow, really, and I kind of just changed my mind and reverted to making the nut a fixed one. But once that was done, again, I've not really had anything noticeable to say about either the oh, do you know something? Let me think about this. I'm just thinking. That went right down, didn't it? No, I'm in the range. I'm in the range. Do I need to lift it up a bit? I was thinking whether this actually needed... Do you know what? I think this needs the smallest of shims. I'm going to do it. Bear with me. Before I tighten any of these strings up, I'm going to do it because I think it needs it. When I was setting it before, I realised that it wasn't in the right place for me. So I'm going to make a quick shim. Anyway, yes, so the Fusion, yeah, on paper everything looks good. Like I say, it doesn't move me though. And that's, you know, there are a few guitars I feel like that about, and I feel very bad for saying it. And one of them that I just cannot get excited about is the Yamaha. And I say this, and I totally accept, hands down, I don't have the talent of fraction of the ability required to outplay any of these guitars. They are all way more capable than my playing skill. That's not what we're talking about here. You know, if we all had to be the world's greatest guitarist before we were allowed to, you know, comment on whether a guitar appeals to us or not, it would be pointless because none of us, very few of us are. So granted that my abilities are limited, I can just say that my feeling about the Fusion is it's not for me. And if I had nearly 300 quid to spend, I'm not entirely sure it would be on something like that. But then again, I don't know what it would be. Well, actually, there's a good example. So the one I did recently was for Tim, the Florida dentist, who's coming over to pick them up shortly. And he had two Harley Bentons delivered to me to set up for him. One was the Fusion 3, and the other one was a Harley Benton, what's that thing called? Double Cut Junior. And the Double Cut Junior came in at about 130 quid, if that, I can't remember now. Not much more than that, or around about that. Now that is a guitar I would rather spend 130 odd quid on than 275 quid on the Fusion 3. And okay, what do you get for your less money? With the double cut, you get a single P90 volume tone, and that's your lot. You know, it's very, very basic, but it is the kind of thing that kind of grabs you straight away and makes you think, I could play this, I could enjoy this, I could modify this and still have money left over. And I think that feels like to me it feels more, it's more interesting to me, that guitar. But having said that, you know, it's not as capable as the Fusion. It hasn't got as much in the way of tonal options, obviously, but it has a distinct appeal, and it's inexpensive as well, which is not a bad thing. So this, by the way, this I'm going to put a shim on this, and I'm going to have to realign it once the strings are on, because this neck was not properly aligned and doesn't really want to be properly aligned either, so it's a little bit problematic. It's going to involve a bit of pushing and shoving. So Sid, it's a lukewarm one from me, and that's, I totally accept that's a personal, or point out it's a personal subjective choice. Just doesn't make me want one. And I don't know why not. You know, it's who could say? Who knows why? Right. So first of all, one of the things I noticed also about these screws, they're a little bit. You don't really want screws that sit there in the bodywood. It's not too bad, but you prefer the holes were a little bit looser than that. So I'm putting in my regulation 0.25mm shim in the back here, because I know that this will lift the action up just enough so that what happens is I can lower these saddles down a bit. Sorry, raise the saddles up a bit. At the moment they're a bit low, so it means to get the action we want, they end up with the little screws sticking out into your hands. So I'm just going to push this together. Obviously I've got strings dangling around, so I've got to be a little bit more careful. I'll be back with you on the Q&A any second now. Yeah, it's a funny one. I feel unkind to the, you know, to in respect of the Fusion. It just may well be a perfectly personal preference in style of guitar. It doesn't move me in the same way as I mentioned that, you know, Pacificas don't do it for me much, and that's not their fault. It's not my thing. Okay, so Lee Francis says, regarding the Banana Sam, what type of truss rod do you recommend? Well, I began by, when I started doing it, actually, Mike Taylor's question, let's put the two things together, so I'll put them together. Mike Taylor's question is, I'm really fascinated by the strings on fret level you do with the Katana Hem Banana, aka truss rod. What made you adopt this, and what, if any, would you say are the pitfalls or things to avoid when using it? Have you come up with a technique for easily removing stripped out hex sockets on Allen nuts, especially inside under the tongue of acoustics where space is limited? I can answer that part of the question quickly, Mike, and the answer for that is no. I don't. I think you're in the sort of territory where if you have to try and save, if you're needing to save a stripped truss rod, I think you're in the sort of land of those specialist tools that I know. I'm pretty certain that StewMac has a cute thing for doing that, which I've never got around to buying, but it probably would at some point if I find myself in that situation. I've never thought of buying one up front because I've rarely encountered it, to be honest. But when you know, it's always when you don't have any way out that you find you've got the problem. So no, I don't really know a good answer other than, you know, start with StewMac. I think pretty sure they've got a solution for it. And failing that, there's probably someone online that's developed a nifty way to do it. But of course, you'd have to evaluate that for sort of whether it makes sense or not, because sometimes some of these solutions are just ludicrous and don't work. But to come back to I'm wiping on some cleaner. Come back to the question about the Banana Hem Katana. It's a long old story, but I've told it a few times before, but I'll tell it again since you asked, because that's the only fair thing to do. The name Banana is a jokesy name, and the reason I chose the jokesy name was a bit of a sort of spit in the eye of a person towards a person who made a tool called the Katana, which I bought. Well, sorry, somebody lent me first, and I became a convert to the way of leveling. It just suddenly, after not making sense, I just suddenly got it, and it seemed like a totally sensible way to do it. And then I bought one myself at full price, and the story goes a bit like this. So I bought I'd not long been doing Relove guitars, and in typical Relove guitars fashion, if I ever found something that I liked, I would praise it without any need for recompense. I will have paid for the tool myself, full price, but I just thought it was so good, and the system or the method of doing it was so elegant and sensible when you stop to think about it, that I loved the thinking behind it, and I was happy to have paid the 150 quid or whatever it was, because I just thought it's a brilliant solution, and I paid to be enlightened how to do it, or you know, to even be I paid to be introduced to this brilliant, elegant idea, and even paying to just be introduced to it was worth the money, right? So I started using it, and because I was using it, I just featured it in my videos, because I can't do these videos without you seeing what I'm using. So I featured it, and the more I used it, this was all within a couple of weeks of getting it. I went straight into using it, and I kind of sang its praises in the videos I made, because I was just thought it was a brilliant thing, and I was happy. Now, can you imagine somebody just get who I am? I'm a guy who, at the time, I had about 7,000 subs on my YouTube. So you've got a guy who's got 7,000 subs, who was paid for your tool. You haven't even had to send it to him or give him one for free, so he'll make nice comments about it, like Glary hope you'll do. You know, this guy's bought the tool, using it himself, and is spontaneously praising it and recommending it to his subscribers. That's kind of worth priceless, right? So it was, and so I talked about how great I thought it was, and I think what I did stupidly, I think I wrote the guy an email, and he was an Italian guy working out of Japan, probably hence the name Katana. And I wrote to him, and I just said, I'm Sam from Relove Guitars. I bought your tool, and I just think it's absolutely brilliant. I've been recommending it wholeheartedly to my subscribers. I hope you get more sales. You know, it's a genius bit of thinking, right? And I just felt good. You know, I got a great tool. I was doing it the way I really believed it should be done. And I'd taken the time out, because I thought I was a nice guy. I took time out to thank the guy, and I was willingly recommending this product. Yes, there's a but coming. Anyway, about a week or so, a few days after, the guy contacted me, and he said, I've had a chance to watch your video. Thank you for recommending the tool. I'm not really sure I like the way something or other, the word you used here, or the way you described it. It's not right the way you said this, that, or the other. So I kind of, all right, I digested it. I mean, I'm cutting this short. It was a few exchanges. And but the thing that really struck me was that, oops, I seem to have run out of something. Hold on. Low power mode, close. Are you still recording? You are. I'm going to have to quickly, I'm going to have to start again. Hold on. Oh, sorry, we ran out of battery on the bleeding phone, so I've had to kill the thing and start again. But anyway, so sound is only coming out of the phone now, or out of this Sony, which never fails. Anyway, yeah, so basically, the guy started to get at me because he didn't like the way I'd described his tool. You know, it's really strange to me, because the thing I noticed was I wasn't expecting a medal, but I have to say, if somebody had bought my thing, and had taken the time to write to me to thank me for it, expressed how happy he was with it, and on top of that, let me know that he was recommending it to 6,000, 8,000 subscribers on YouTube. I'd probably begin my reply to that person's email with, thanks a million, that's fantastic of you, I'm glad you're so happy with the blah, blah, blah. But he didn't. He kind of obviously hadn't looked at the email. As soon as he hadn't looked at it for a couple of days, and then as soon as he looked at it, he decided he wasn't happy with how I described his invention. And so he didn't say, thanks for buying it, nothing like that. Or I'm glad you really love it, and yeah, it took me years to make, and you know, whatever. He just went straight into presuming to tell me what I could and couldn't say. And of course, I read that email, and I sort of went away. I felt a bit stupid, actually. I felt a bit hurt. that I'd been so effusive, and this guy could care so little, that all he could think of doing was kind of telling me off about the way I represented his product. And I just thought, that's not right. So I kind of thought about it, and I came back to him with my reply, and I said, no offense, but I did say that I really valued the product, and I was happy to recommend it. And I don't understand why you're feeling so bad about it. And it was something like that. And he kind of came back and started telling me that I had no right to refer to it this way or show it in that way. And then, at that point, I started to get just completely gobsmacked. And I said to him, oh God, this is back to front, isn't it? Damn it. I sort of, eventually there came a point where I'd stopped I was trying to be nice every time, because that's how I am. I try to be pleasant and friendly. But eventually I got so kind of put out that I came back to him and I said, it is on the right side. I came back to him and said, look, I don't, correct me if I'm mad, but I bought this thing from you, and I promoted this thing, and I was thrilled with it, and blah 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 blah, and I made a video about it and featured it in my videos, and said, oh, actually I featured it in several videos, just saying how good it was, and I said, I don't really get that, how all you can do is tell me that I should and shouldn't say this, or you're not happy that I showed your product, in such a way, and that I'm technically wrong, and this was a complete misrepresentation, and the whole tone was getting really nasty. And as he was telling me what I could and couldn't say, it was this very strong feeling like he was talking to me like he had paid me as a PR person or something, and that I had no right to say what I wanted, and that I should, even as a customer, I should somehow, sorry, it's now too loud, I know. 1 second. Just there was this assumption that he had a default right to tell me what I could and couldn't say about his product, despite me being Anyway, so eventually I kind of ran out of trying to hope that he would see the nice side of the fact that I recommended it and I was excited by it and so forth and so on. And I said to him, look, I'm really puzzled about this. I said, because I've been in business quite a bit, and I said, I hope you don't mind me saying, but you've managed to turn me from, in a few short days, you've turned me from an absolutely glowing advocate for this thing into somebody who actually, you might as well have made me into an enemy, because I'm, I just feel so bad about this whole thing now. I just don't want anything to do with it. And I had to say as well, at one point he absolutely blew out at me about how the Chinese were stealing his patent, or people like me, I have no respect for, like I'd stolen his patent or something. And I'm a reasonable guy, and what I obviously picked up is, oh right, this guy's really struggling with the capitalizing his invention, right? It's a typical business story. You make something, you might be a great luthier, you might be a superb player or whatever, but you may be struggling to be a businessman and protect your thing, or know how to capitalize it, right? And I suddenly realized he was taking out all his business woes on me, and it was all somehow down to what I had said or shown, and the fact that he was terrified that the Chinese, because I'd shown a picture of his thing too close up, it therefore meant that, I presume it meant that the Chinese would see it and know how to copy it, and therefore it would be my fault that his children starved or something. And I was just like, I was literally gobsmacked. And so it came to, he sort of did all that, and it came to this head, and I just said to him, do you know what, whatever his name was, I said, do you understand, I'm a customer, you cannot treat your customers like this. I said, 150 quid's a lot of money, and I said, buy something that expensive, when there are other methods, it's going to be so dependent on you treating people well for them to spend a lot of money up front on an unknown thing. But I said, if all you need to do is be nice to them, and they'll not only buy the damn thing, they'll promote you. And yet you've managed to turn me from an advocate into an enemy within about 2, 3, 4 days maximum. I said, that's quite an achievement. And I said, and I made a point at the end of that email, something about, you just don't treat customers this way. If I was your employee who you'd hired to represent you as a PR agent, maybe, but I'm a customer, not an employee. And then within seconds, he refunded me on the purchase, and that was the end of that. No more will I speak to you. You're no longer a customer, so I don't have to say or do anything with you in mind. And I could see it was a psychological end of, right, you're off my books, I don't care. You're no longer a customer because I've given you back your money. And of course, I was there I had my money back, and I had the stupid tool. And I thought to myself, right, well, what do I do now? Because I still want to level frets this way. And of course, in the time I'd been, having this conversation, even in the first few days, it was obvious to me that I could make something like this that worked pretty well, actually. And it further made me realize that if your business model is kind of based on hoping that somebody doesn't make one themselves at home because it's so straightforward, then it's not a very good business model if somebody else can just come along and innovate it and DIY it. But anyway, so I was in a position where I still wanted to level frets that way. So I did what I had to do, which was I innovated and I made myself a truss rod and started using it. And lo and behold, I found that the key thing that my method had to do that his didn't was I had to move the string slightly to the side. And actually, I found that was so little of a, so little inconvenience, it wasn't worth worrying about. It was no big deal at all, as you can see when I did the leveling. So I innovated my own version and got into using it and found the results straight away were perfectly good and carried on using it. And as the years went by, of course, when I got a bit of experience in doing it, I called it the banana in kind of tongue-in-cheek or poking a tongue out at this person because it rhymed with katana. And I thought, I'm never going to promote your thing, particularly given that I can show people how to innovate and improvise, that's the word, improvise their own for almost no money. And to be honest, my first truss rod I used for quite some time was taken from a broken Squier neck, and it worked perfectly well. In fact, it's still up there on the wall on a magnet. So that's where the banana name came from, and that's why I ended up using it, because even though the guy was an absolute prat as far as I'm concerned and shot himself in the foot, I still wanted to level frets this way, and I was determined to do it because it was a great way of doing it. And I have never shied away from saying that I learned this method, the principle, learned from using the katana. And I would have carried on using the katana had the guy not been such an absolute plonker in how he behaved. But I I simply was not going to promote it when I was treated that badly, and I don't think it would have been right to. So that's how that ended up. So that's the story of the katana, which I occasionally tell. And I know the guy will probably see me talking about it sometime. There's no slander. I think I've still somewhere. I'll probably have the whole email trail of how ridiculously he behaved, and it was utterly ridiculous. And I have no fear in what I say because I only ever say the truth about it. There was nothing I did that was in any way out of order or improper in terms of being a customer. particularly since I was glowing about the damn product. And anyway, so that's where it came from. And so the question you went on to ask is, are there any pitfalls and things to avoid when using it? What I discovered is that in the first few months of using it, it works. And the things to watch out for there is the things that are challenging there are you can find yourself being too, you can over level if you're not careful, but it's not so likely if you're using only, I don't know, something like 400 grit. It's quite hard to wear it away that quick. But the pitfalls really are often not leveling enough. It can be. I was guilty, or I was always tended to give up too quick because I was nervous about taking away too much material. But so that's a pitfall. You can, if you keep going and you misdiagnosing what you think is fret buzz, which isn't, you can keep. I've done that in the past, not with this method, but actually I did it with the fret rocker method. I thought something was buzzing and I thought the frets were buzzing and it was something else, and I carried on and took too much material away. Another one where using the old flat method with a standard file, I used a fret rocker. I can't find it, but I used an aluminium fret rocker which had already worn so badly, well, not you could see it, but it had worn enough for the thing to be rocking incorrectly. Here, this is a metal one, but I had an aluminium one of these, and it had worn over time in all of the three places in a fixed range across those, and there were three little gaps there, and when you tried to use it, it would just not tell you the truth. And I levelled away a set of frets on the basis of that until I realised it was rubbish. This method doesn't require the fret rocker at all. Never use it anymore, same as I don't use the notched ruler. I will say the technique, somebody who's kind of patient and good at learning from doing with their hands can learn a lot about how to use this thing successfully really quickly. However, I found that I've continued learning from it over 8 years of using it, or 7 or 8 years. So there's a ton to learn all the time as you go on. And I wouldn't have predicted that at the beginning. I couldn't have imagined that having got it to work, I'm looking for a thing which I now can't find. Having got it to work, I couldn't imagine there would be 8 years worth of learning still to do. And actually there is, and obviously I'm not going to go into too much of it just now because I want to produce another ebook about it as soon as I get time to do it. But it works straight out of the box with a standard sort of truss rod nicked out of a broken old neck, one like this, which is the only reason I stopped using it. It's a little more flexible than the one I do use, which is the U-channel truss rod, which is actually double the thickness, but because it's in this U-channel wraparound thing, it's got a little bit more stiffness, and that comes in handy for the more sophisticated, advanced use of this tool, which I will be hopefully writing about before too long, and possibly selling some ebooks on the subject of. Anyway, but that's why. So it's a long story. It's a bit miserable, going over somebody's somebody's nastiness of a time, when it was so unnecessary. But I just, it was an almost ludicrous situation, and I guess it paid him back in that I think he's still selling them, but I think he lost all the recommendations he could have had. And I have had somebody else since. Somebody did tell me that they had similar dealings with him, and it was kind of very thingying when you hear that, validating, because you go, it's not just me. George, I can be done. We can finish this. George Sears says, what's the best material for guitar nuts? I would say Tusk. Tusk is PTFE, or what's that non-stick stuff on saucepans? You know what I mean. Teflon impregnated. And so it makes it a naturally slippy stuff. It does. The reason why when I discovered how vitally important the nut is in everything, it's probably the most important thing to spend time on your guitar if you're going to improve anything right there. So you see that on a guitar like this, I have upgraded to a Tusk nut and a fitted Tusk strings trees, even though it might have come, this is good news, because it might have come with sort of standard, even Fendery looking string, these aren't, but it might have come with Fendery string trees. I will still go with Tusk. This cuts well if you have to cut it. Most of the time I don't. In this case I did, because I don't think this was a 12-inch radius nut when I started out, so I had to cut these things down to the correct radius, which is absolutely fine, but it needed cutting, for which I use these Hosco files, which are great because they make a very clean, they're the best slot a file, in my experience, can make. Okay, it's that little shiny bit where the thing is sitting right on the front edge, but that is the best slot you'll get with a bought file compared to any of the other types, which will be raggedier. So Tusk is by far the best. It's pre-lubricated, if you like. They make a big deal about it. It sounds a bit flash, but it's a bit like using PTFE plastic, which is by definition incredibly. And hold here a second, I'll show you what I mean. It's incredibly slippy, and you can use it for all manner of things. I bought some a while back when I made a sort of sled for whatever that thing's called, routing, and this is expensive as hell, this stuff, but it feels like handling coconut. It's slippery, and two bits together will sail over each other for an hour until the end of time. So it's a very good lubricated surface, PTFE. That's got that impregnated. Most of the time when I fit nuts, I do it so that I don't even have to touch the slots with a file, which means you're getting the advantage of the factory slots and you're getting the advantage of the Tusk. And if you get that right, then your guitar, along with doing the stretching of the strings, which I haven't done on this one yet, but your guitar will then stay in tune. It has bugger all to do with these babies. They're to do with the precision of getting it in tune and the feel of it, but they will not hold it in tune if that's wrong. So Tusk, I went originally from whatever it came with, plastic, which will work. It's not the end of the world, but most plastic nuts end up gripping because they're just, there you go, there's a plastic one. They're just not really, they haven't got the same coefficients as this. I went to bone, and actually bone just takes forever, and you have to continually widen it, fine tune it with sandpaper until there's absolutely no grip, and it can take so long to do. It's a nice substance, I've got no problem with it as a substance, but it's just too time consuming to get it right. And this Tusk is worth it, because once that's right, you've got no tuning problems. So that's it, George. Tusk every time. I'm a convert and I'll stay with it. Al says, with wiring, is your attitude the more push-pulls the better, or only if I'll use it? That's a great question, Al. And Al puts on his question, he's been both guys, which made me laugh, because so have I. I think we all get to be both guys at some point, and usually only as makers. From a maker point of view, there's a time where I would want to put in, as many functions as possible. And the truth is, you quickly reach a place where you can't remember what things do. And I've got my Rickenbacker headless Rickenbacker tribute thing that I made for fun, and that's got so many functions on it, I barely can remember where I am. So that's exceeded the functional, sensible, usable amount. So these days I'm totally as little as I need. In other words, the latter, the only if I'll use it. Sometimes customers will push you beyond that, and I've had customers who say, I want X amount of pickups, and then I want this kind of switching. Not naming any names, Adam, but Adam is slightly different. Adam comes, when Adam specs a build, Adam comes from knowing what he wants it to do. So he is
only if I'll use it, even though it looks complicated. But there are lots of customers in the past who have just said, and can I have coil tapping? Can I have, phase switching? And what else can I have? And you can put them all in, and then you very quickly, it's a sort of compounding thing. You add one function and it compounds the number of functions to everything else, and it goes up almost exponentially. So you very quickly become lost. So I'll definitely only if I'll use it. But I have done it, and I have done it when customers have insisted, even though I know they will never use it. I've done it because ultimately I've advised the best I can, and the customer still wants it. This is great. This is a really nice thing to come around to. Mark, we've talked about yours, which is the Swift. I've not seen Swift, but you've hit on the thing that a basic Les Paul copy with frets leveled and cleaned and set up the best you can. Well, absolutely love it. Now I did the thing a while back where I bought a rock tile, white rock tile Les Paul copy, cheap as chips. It had a broken neck. It was kind of split on the back of the neck, but it looked like it would be an easy glue together, a very clean break. You just, they'd be left with a visual finish thing, but I could still get it nice and smooth and covered over, just so it felt smooth. It didn't look perfect, but I bought it and I fixed it and set it up for a friend's son for his first guitar. And in the time between when I finished the neck repair and setting it up, while I was doing it, I discovered that the body was made completely of MDF. Never seen before a guitar with an MDF body. And all the holes, around the edge of the holes and the screw holes, they were all shaggy and it was, falling to bits. But it was absolutely blinding to play. I loved it because it was so cheap and cheerful, and I'd saved it from the dead. It sounded great to me. It was screaming through an amp, and it was fab to play. And it had weight because it was MDF. It felt really chunky and solid, even though it was made of stuff that would eventually fall apart. But I think the Swift is probably in the same brand or same line as that. You're in the right mood. You've done some work to it. You've saved it from being crap, and you're having fun playing it. What more is there to it really than that? That's the essence of it. And coming back to Johnny's question, are there any bad? Truthfully, Johnny, there are very few bad budget guitars. They all, as Mark's shown, they can all, with a bit of work on the frets, as I talked about right at the beginning, concentrating on the nut and then setting it up the way you like it, and then not being too precious about it, you can have an absolute ton of fun, and sometimes even more fun because you've not bought into the crap about, and I've got this £2,000 guitar and the nut is still wrong, or the finish, I can see where they took a early finish at the factory in Kalamazoo or whatever. Nothing like a £50 Les Paul copy that you've made into an absolute pub rocker for practically nothing. So, and the final question of tonight, of this question and answer, is from Daniel Jordan. And Daniel says, converting a top-loading Tele to, well, this isn't top-loading, but it could be top-loading. Converting a top-loading Tele to a through body, is it worth it? Great question. As someone who owns countless parts casters, mostly clones, do you think they are better value for money than as new Fender, for example? Let's take that second one first. So, is a Fender, as new Fender Telecaster, for example, Quo style Telecaster, is that better value for money? So it's better value for money in that a Fender Telecaster, American-made Fender Telecaster, for example, you might pay 900 quid for or something, that will hold its value, right? So in true monetary value, that is more valuable than a parts caster, which it doesn't even represent the value of what's been put into it. So it never even holds the value of the parts you put into it, far less any residual value as a complete guitar. So you never even get the parts money back. That's brutal, right? But it's true. Nobody's interested unless somebody sees you're selling it and they see a set of Seymour Duncans and it's worth more than the asking price. Then it's worth buying. But generally speaking, a parts caster you can sink hundreds and hundreds of pounds into it in terms of quality parts, and you won't get a penny back. It'll still be a homemade parts caster by somebody with a good will, maybe a bit of skill as well, but it's still a parts caster. And it means that if they needed money back on it, they could probably only ever achieve a going rate for a good, nice parts caster. Maybe a bit more if somebody comes and plays it and it's really nice to play and whatever. But you'll be in the 200 quid realm for a parts caster if you're lucky, even if you spent 600 quid on parts and 250 quid setting it up or modifying it. So true to say, a better value for money in terms of holding its value is a Fender will always be better in that respect. But strictly speaking, if you're just saying which is better value as a playing experience, I think you don't get any more playing experience by paying the extra 500 quid premium for the 700 quid Telecaster above a 200 quid one with a good setup. I don't think you get you don't get 700 quid's worth of playing value out of it. Yes, you keep the monetary value because you can sell it again because of the branded name. Not this is Squier, but you know what I mean. So it depends. Is a parts caster good value? It's good value because for a lot less than a branded one, you can get a great playing experience. But actually, when you start putting quality parts onto a chassis, you are losing all the time against a branded name, because even though Fender charges a premium, they are benefiting from a massive economies of scale that you don't. And so the parts that you're paying a couple of £100 for to add into your guitar put you at a disadvantage straight away. So your thing is always going to end up costing much more than you could ever recoup for it. And I think the bang for buck comes at the low end when you find a decent chassis like Mark in the last question, and you get it for 50 quid, you set it up yourself for no cost because you know how to do it, and then the money you've saved on not buying a 900 quid Fender, you spend a fraction of that on a top quality Lola pickup for the neck on this guitar, and then you play the hell out of it. I think that's where the value comes in. But don't ever make the mistake of thinking you can start producing Telecasters from parts that will in any way become an attractive proposition to a consumer, because you cannot. You are so far away from being able to compete. I had a whole thing in my head. I was going to talk about some of the, when it came back from the people who've all tried to get into the budget brand or tried to go beyond the budget brand. There's so many people you'll have seen on YouTube who, with all goodwill, best meaning people, who've ended up trying to, they've got into making guitars, they've got a name for themselves on YouTube, and maybe like me, somebody will come to them and say, hey Sam, why don't you get into cahoots with a Chinese company and start producing your Trekkie headless travel guitars or something. And for a lot of people that's too attractive, and they get into it, and then they've realized too late that they're actually turning into people who are trying to run a cutthroat margins business, when actually all they really were interested in was playing guitars and making one or two now and then. I didn't get up this morning to be a guy trying to out compete Fender or Harley Benton to produce yet another samey guitar, which they are that much different, another entrant onto the market. We've all know, I mean, even Westfield in its day was one of those. A well-meaning guy, had totally strong focus on quality, managed to apply a lot of it, got them to produce some good guitars. But eventually, I guess, they went out of business or gave up the business because it just isn't worth it in the end. You can't compete against Harley Benton. There's no point. Harley Benton will always be a jump ahead. They'll always have the economy of scale. So, and the biggest thing of all is waking up 10 years down the line after all that stress, finding that you've done less of what you enjoyed, which was hand carving a guitar for somebody who really wanted you to hand carve it, maybe one of those every few months, and you've tried to compete. You realize without knowing it, you've tried to become somebody who was forced in the end to become a cost cutter, because that's all you're going to compete on in the end of mass-produced guitars. You're going to undercut somebody for the same type of product, because the cruel consumer wants it same thing that you're producing for 10 quid less, and they'll get it because somebody else will cut the cost, and either you cut the cost or you go out of business. I didn't wake up wanting to do that this morning. And most of the people who got suckered or lured into trying to produce a range of guitars, I think fell foul of that. That's my personal take. So to finish off at the end, Daniel, so we've done the second part, the parts casters. The first question is making a top-loading Tele into a through body one. Is it worth it? Let me just get you something to show you why it's worth it. Where's the other thing? Oh yeah, there's two things. Everybody tries to do it because even if for a period of time, you believe what people say, that a string through body is so much better than a top-loaded Telecaster. I come back to what I said at the beginning about the Tonewoods. I can't tell the difference. I could not tell you the difference between a string through body. I just play it and I enjoy both of them. I don't care whether it's string through or top loaded. Some people really do, and that may be a combination of more experience and knowing what they're hearing, or it could be more. They may be more vulnerable to bull, dogma, and they may convince themselves they hear a difference. But one of the things I'll say is that going with through holes is a massive constraint. If you want to complicate your life in building, if you want to do some first builds and get great guitars for bang for the buck, then don't go for string through body. I think I said that at the beginning. The reason why is that first of all the bridges in the world have different places where they put their string through holes. Right, this one's right at the back. Notice that right on this back line. That won't work for a Telecaster type thing, or in fact, it won't work for the kind of Telecaster with square saddles. So it really only works with this kind of. Anyway, there are constraints, and if you try and change your bridge after you've started out with this one, you have no hope, because those holes will not suit a more modern bridge, because you will not be able to position the thing and line up. So the more holes you have to line up, the more difficult it's going to get, and you don't need that hassle. And that's before you even come to the major hassle on string through, which is when you've got a lump of wood. How do you make some holes that come through, that line up perfectly here, and then come out at the other side into a perfect position line of ferrules, or holes that you can then put ferrules into on that side? And although it's easy in a factory, when you're in your workshop, it is nowhere near as easy as that. First of all, most of us don't have a pillar drill with a wide enough throat. This probably just could get in, and I could drill those holes on this side and on the other side, possibly. But most guitars are a bit longer than that, and this would be the extent of my drill throat. And certainly other Strats, for example, will have a closer, the holes will be a bit further forward or whatever. So not many drills will let you reach. So most of us end up thinking, God, we're going to have to try and drill through. So the first thing we do is try and drill through. And you'll notice that even a line in straight line on one side will exit like the worst thing you've ever seen. And that's often people's first experience of doing it, a disaster. And then they end up putting a plate in the back to cover things up and hide the fact that they've made a total disaster. And I've got one kicking around somewhere. Oh, it's gone now. Oh, it's always the way, isn't it? I saw a thing knocking about the other day that came from way back in the old days when I'd done something and I had to fix it. And I thought, oh, I know, I could refer to that. Well, whatever it was, it's a plate that I had to make to cover up the screw up I made. Anyway, but that's the first experience most of us have. Then you kind of go online and you kind of reluctantly learn that the way people do it is that they sort of drill 6 there downwards, and you can do that fairly accurately, but don't expect to go through this thick body and come out in the same place. So what you've got to do is drill from this side and control it so you get a really good looking set of holes in that side. And you go, well, that's sensible, but how do you know where this should fall? Because then what you have to do is you have to be able to somehow mark where this thing is and translate it to the exact same spot on the other side. That is a lot harder than you think it is. And if you get it wrong, the holes won't line up. They'll pass each other. If you get it just off, they'll work. So you have to be pretty accurate, but it's not the end of the world. You can do it. I tried thinking to myself, oh, I know, I'll have a nice solid string guide, make it out of a block of wood, because I've worked out early on that if you drill them all straight in line here, you should be able to control it. So I'd go by hand, and it came out still ragged at the other side, relatively speaking. It wasn't acceptable. Then I thought, okay, I want to do it again, but I want to be able to do it. So I use the same kind of guide, but I'll drill halfway here and then I'll mark up where it should be and I'll drill the other half over there. And I this time went to brass, and I made a block of brass which I cut very carefully and as slowly as possible. And to my astonishment, I managed to get it to be pretty even. And I did a test on that bit of spare wood here, and amazingly the drill came through there and came out the back end exactly on the line like that. And that's because I had a little marker line down the side. I don't know where you can see that. It's a little marker line, see it? And just lining those two up gave me that impression. Then I also did a similar thing by drilling some pre-drilled 6mm holes as if I was putting ferrules in, and then I put that on top of there again and lined it up, and lo and behold, those smaller holes went straight through in the center of the ferrules, and I thought, I can do this. So now I've done it with a custom guitar I'm making for someone, and they all lined up perfectly. So this is a good device that I've made, and this is a huge spread, by the way. Of course, you might have recognized this is made for Andre the Giant. It's definitely not a standard guitar, but the point being is you actually can, this has freed me to be able to do this very accurately and with a handheld drill, right? So on any guitar in future, I can have a block like this set up for a standard width spacing for Telecasters or whatever. Make one block for it. It's expensive, but I'll make a block for it. And then I can, as long as I can mark the correct position on either sides, I know that this will give me a straight drill, and it's great that it's a nice chunky bit of brass. So the question is, do you want to make it into a through body? Is it worth it? I would say this: it's worth it if you want to learn a shed load about the challenges of where bridges go and how these holes here impact what kinds of bridge you can use, being committed to the bridge you're going to use before you start making holes. If you chose this bridge and then you made the holes there, and then somebody gave you a better bridge that you liked everything, whatever, better, and yet the holes are in a different position, you're screwed. You can't use it. Even if there's a difference between, any difference at all between where those holes are and where the pickup cavity is, you're stuffed. So it increases the complication. I don't think it adds anything major, but I would say do it just for the learning experience, because screwing it up plenty of times and making a wooden block that was inadequate to a more precise thing that I used in anger the other day successfully is very satisfying. There you go. Right, well, look, I'm going to reach a conclusion on this whole thing and clear off home. And I'd just like to say thank you if you stuck it out this long. Thank you, for your questions. Thank you, Ralph, for the guitar to set up. Thank you to everyone on Facebook who put the questions in. Much appreciated. Hope it was useful in some way. Hope it was more interesting than hearing me talk about Ukraine, for those people who don't like to hear that. And can I just say one thing? I never usually do this, but a lot of this stuff that can help, is in my ebook, 5 Steps to Guitar Setup Heaven, which will show you how to make and use the banana, whether it's with a standard truss rod like this or the U channel, is up to you. But this is usually knocking around somewhere. Everyone's got a few. Very cheap, and this isn't that expensive for what it gives you. But the ebook shows you how to make and use this tool and get great results with it, and also to do your nut slots and things like that with very simple tools, including doing the fret crowning with this tool, which you might not want to use. You might want a more expensive crowning file, but I wanted to show how to do it with as little expenditure as possible, because I wanted people to know that you don't have to spend a load on expensive luthier tools to get a great setup. even if you do like I did in the videos, or in the ebook and all the videos that accompany it, I show how to cut the nut slots with a file like this, which might be about £1 worth out of a set. And this will give you perfectly good nut slots. If you leave them as deep V notches, they're ugly, but once you've cut them to the right height, which you measure over the first fret, then you can file off any unwanted material on the nut, and it actually looks very low key and low level, and it looks very good. And more importantly, it doesn't cost you hardly anything. So there's a load to learn in that, and every section of the setup is accompanied by a video, step-by-step video for each section, which will show you how to do it in painfully real time. So if you like the idea of that, go across to the Really Love Guitars Facebook page and have a look at the pinned post on there, and it shows how to buy the 2 of my ebooks from me directly, because if you can do that, that would be a great help, because Amazon and Apple take a big chunk if you buy it through them. So if you buy it directly from me, I get the cover price, which helps a lot. Okay, hope you enjoyed the mixture of question and answer. Thank you for all those questions. I'll see you again soon for another setup. Take care, everyone.